Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity gets cozy and old mysteries take the scenic route to sleep. Tonight's quiet journey drifts far beyond the familiar edges of our solar system, out where the sun's light grows faint and the air itself becomes more imagination than matter. It's a story about a hidden world, one said to wander in darkness, only sometimes crossing paths with the realms we know. Some call it Nibiru, others call it the 12th planet, the home of gods, the cradle of visitors, the great crossing. Before we begin tracing its orbit through myth and memory, I wonder where in the world you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe you're lying in bed, lights low, a little curious, a little sleepy. The idea that somewhere out there another world could exist, a world that comes and goes, unseen but not forgotten, has kept people awake for centuries. And yet, here we are, using it as a lullaby. If you find this story soothing, intriguing, or simply a nice way to drift, I'd be so grateful if you'd give the video a like or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of wonder reach others who might need a soft escape too. So, take a breath. Let your thoughts slow, and imagine looking up at the night sky as the ancients once did. Each star a mystery, each faint moving light a messenger. Somewhere in that silent sea, hidden between orbits and myths, lies Nibiru, the planet that, according to ancient tablets, once carried the gods themselves across the stars. The story of Nibiru doesn't begin with telescopes or space probes. It begins in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, where farmers looked to the sky not for galaxies but for guidance. The people of Sumer, living between the Tigris and Euphrates, believed the heavens were a map written by divine hands. Every star, every wandering point of light had meaning. They charted their movements on clay tablets, using reed styluses to carve the language of the gods. Among those countless cuneiform markings lies a word that has echoed through millennia: Nibiru. To the Sumerians, Nibiru meant the crossing, or the place of transition. It was associated with movement, with something that passed through, connecting realms. Sometimes it referred to a point in the sky where celestial paths intersected. Sometimes it was the name of a body itself, an object, possibly a planet that appeared, vanished, and returned after long ages. The scholars who later deciphered those ancient texts found the words scattered through myths, prayers, and lists of heavenly bodies, always surrounded by an air of reverence. But long before modern readers speculated about alien worlds, the Sumerians already imagined gods who came from the sky. Their pantheon, the Anunnaki, were not distant abstractions but tangible beings. They built, they ruled, they quarrelled, and they left behind stories that blur the line between divine legend and possible memory. Nibiru, in some interpretations, was their home. The idea would have been simple enough for an ancient stargazer to believe. The night sky was alive with movement. The planets, those bright wanderers, traced paths that defied the fixed constellations. Among them, the Sumerians recognized 5 visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each one was tied to a deity, each part of the great heavenly mechanism. And then there were the strange visitors, comets, stars that flared and faded, signs that came and went. It wasn't hard to imagine one of these as a world unlike the rest, one that appeared only after ages, bringing with it change, upheaval, and perhaps the return of those who once departed. Centuries later, when scholars like Zecharia Sitchin read those tablets anew, the ancient notion of Nibiru found a second life. He proposed that Nibiru wasn't merely symbolic. It was a literal planet, an enormous world on a long elliptical orbit that carried it far beyond Neptune for thousands of years before sweeping back through the inner solar system. According to his readings, it was inhabited by the Anunnaki, technologically advanced beings who visited Earth in the distant past and seeded human civilization. The idea struck a deep chord in modern imagination, a hidden planet that circles back every few millennia, bringing with it gods, disasters, or revelations. It sounded like something between science and scripture. But even before Sitchin, whispers of a Planet X had already begun to haunt astronomy. In the 19th century, astronomers searching for patterns in the orbits of Uranus and Neptune noticed tiny irregularities. They suggested another unseen body might be tugging at them from beyond. The search for that mystery planet, initially a purely mathematical quest, became a media fascination. When Pluto was discovered in 1930, some thought the mystery solved. But Pluto was far too small to account for the gravitational quirks. The possibility of another planet, massive, distant, hidden, lingered. And so myth and mathematics began to overlap. The ancient word Nibiru, once a term from Mesopotamian cosmology, now found itself entangled with modern astrophysics. Some saw coincidence, others saw confirmation. A planet beyond the known ones, unseen but influential, matched both the astronomers' suspicion and the ancient stories. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to feed curiosity. Nibiru's legend grew quietly through the late 20th century, surfacing in books, documentaries and late-night radio shows. It became linked not only to the Anunnaki, but to predictions of cataclysm. Some claimed it would return soon, passing close to Earth and causing tidal chaos. Others said it would herald a new age of awakening. None of those prophecies came true, but the fascination remained. There was something deeply human about it, the yearning to believe that the heavens hold a secret meant for us alone. Modern astronomers, careful and methodical, have continued to look outward. The term Planet 9 now appears in respected journals, referring to a hypothetical massive world beyond Neptune, whose gravity might explain the strange clustering of distant icy objects. Its orbit, if it exists, could take thousands of years to complete, a long looping path through the outer dark. Some even jokingly call it Nibiru, though most mean it with scientific restraint rather than mythic expectation. Still, the resemblance is uncanny. A hidden world far from the sun, exerting quiet influence on the visible ones. In a sense, both stories, the ancient and the modern, speak to the same feeling, that our solar system might not be finished, that somewhere, just beyond our instruments, something vast and silent drift through the dark, unseen but not uninvolved. The ancients didn't have telescopes, but they had imagination, and perhaps memory. The Sumerians left behind a cosmic family tree, with gods descending from heaven to shape humanity. The myths describe sky chariots, loud storms of fire, and beings who brought laws and knowledge. To them, Nibiru wasn't only a celestial coordinate, it was a place of origin. Their gods came from it, and when their work was done, they returned there, promising one day to cross again. To a modern reader, that sounds like myth, but within the myth is a familiar question. What if the sky once touched the earth? What if visitors, whether divine or otherwise, really came from beyond? Every ancient culture has some version of that story. The gods descending, teaching, leaving. Maybe it's symbolic of wisdom arriving from elsewhere. Or maybe it hints at memories older than history itself. Imagine a Sumerian priest thousands of years ago standing on a ziggurat under a velvet sky. The desert air cool, the city lamps flickering below, the Milky Way arcing overhead. He looks up, noting the steady paths of the known planets, the wanderers his ancestors had tracked for generations. But then, once in a lifetime, perhaps something different. A red glimmer appearing where none had been, moving slowly against the stars. The scribes would record it, the priests interpret it, and the myths would grow around it like vines around stone. Over centuries the phenomenon would fade, but the memory would remain, etched into language as Nibiru. It's not difficult to see how the idea of the crossing planet became fused with cycles of destruction and renewal. Ancient texts speak of floods, of fire from the sky, of ages ending and beginning again. A planet that returns after long intervals could easily be seen as both bringer of doom and harbinger of rebirth. To the Sumerians, cosmic order and divine order were the same. When the heavens shifted, so too did the fate of kings. When we talk about Nibiru today, we're not just talking about a lost world. We're talking about the bridge between science and story, the way humans fill the unknown with meaning. This same instinct that once made us carve stars into clay now drives us to aim telescopes into the cold. We're still asking what lies beyond. We're still hoping the darkness hides not emptiness, but company. As the hum of civilization fades into night, the sky remains what it has always been, a mirror for our questions. Somewhere out there, planets spin in silence. Maybe one of them really is Nibiru, the traveller, the crossing place. Or maybe Nibiru was never a place at all but an idea, the reminder that the universe is bigger than we can see, that knowledge itself comes in cycles, vanishing and returning, like a world passing through the deep. For now, we drift here on our small blue sphere, circling the sun, watching, wondering, waiting. The old tablets still whisper, and the telescopes still turn. Between the cuneiform lines and the digital data, between what was believed and what is measured, something lingers. A quiet possibility that the story isn't over, that somewhere in the long night beyond Neptune, a lost world still moves beneath the stars. The world the ancients looked up to was not the neat and orderly solar system we learn about in school. It wasn't a tidy catalogue of planets arranged in a fixed order, each with a specific name, a specific orbit, and a specific set of physical measurements. Instead, the sky was alive, shifting, unpredictable in its details, even if reassuring in its cycles. It was a place where lights wandered, stars flickered, and signs appeared without warning. To the people who watched it with patient eyes, those lights were not just objects. They were messengers, warnings, companions, gods themselves. And so, the heavens earned more names than there were visible worlds. A single point of light could hold 5 identities depending on where it sat, what season it was, and what the priest believed it meant. The sky didn't have 9 planets. It had layers of meaning, each one folded into another like clay pressed into a tablet again and again. In that older world, before telescopes and gravity equations and spacecraft, the planet you know as Jupiter wasn't just Jupiter. It was the king of heaven, the judge of fate, the star of Marduk. Venus wasn't simply Venus. It was Ishtar, the radiant queen, morning star and evening star in different moods. Mars carried not the sterile, quiet face we see through modern lenses, but the fire of war and omens. Saturn drifted slowly in the outer dark as the star of Ninurta, patient and looming. These names weren't merely labels, but ways of understanding the rhythms of human life through celestial motion. And then there were the wanderers whose movements didn't match the predictable patterns, the occasional bright intruders that swept across the heavens for a few weeks or months before fading. To modern eyes, these would be comets or novae. But to the ancients, especially those living in Mesopotamia, any unusual light was a messenger, a reminder that the universe wasn't finished with surprises. When something appeared where nothing had been, the sky gained yet another name. This way of seeing the heavens shaped more than mythology. It shaped the entire structure of daily life. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians built calendars from the sky. They aligned temples with star paths. They planned harvests, festivals, coronations, and wars by tracking the behaviour of lights overhead. And because the sky's movements weren't always consistent, each shift required interpretation. Each wandering star demanded a story. In time, those stories became a vast celestial vocabulary, where a single point on the horizon could signify a god, a season, an omen, or a memory. It was in this swirling cosmos of meanings that the idea of a mysterious traveller like Nibiru found a home, a world that came and went fit perfectly into their way of seeing the universe. The heavens didn't behave like clockwork. They breathed. They made room for wanderers who arrived after long absences. When an unusual star appeared, it was natural to give it a name, and even more natural to weave it into the cosmic order as if it had always belonged. The ancients didn't draw a line between myth and astronomy. The two were threads of the same fabric. When the priests recorded the movements of the planets, they weren't just doing science, they were listening to the gods. When they described alignments, conjunctions, and retrograde motions, they weren't mapping physics. They were mapping stories, relationships, and warnings. The stars were alive in their understanding, and that aliveness allowed the sky to hold countless names. Imagine a time before electric light washed away the darkness. Picture a desert night where the horizon is sharp, the stars crisp, and the Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of pale fire. People would gather on rooftops or temple platforms, letting the night settle around them. The heavens didn't feel distant. They felt immediate, intimate, close enough to reach if only you climbed high enough. In that quiet, someone notices a faint reddish point glowing where no such light had been last month. It moves slightly over days, slower than a comet, but not as predictable as the known planets. The priest takes note. The scribes mark it on fresh clay. People talk. The city listens. Before long, the mysterious point gains a name, perhaps borrowed from an older story or shaped by the moment's concerns. This was how the heavens grew crowded with identities. Our modern sky is a place of numbers and coordinates. We speak of right ascension, orbital inclination, albedo, mass, and atmospheric composition. We name planets, but we rarely personalize them. We treat them like distant laboratories waiting to be explored. This scientific perspective gives us enormous precision, but it also strips the sky of the layered richness it once held. The ancients saw something more fluid, where each heavenly body could slip in and out of meanings, and so a concept like Nibiru didn't have to be pinned to a single physical object. It could shift depending on context. In some texts, it refers to the crossing point of the sky, a kind of cosmic threshold. In others, it seems to be associated with Jupiter or Marduk's star. In still others, it appears to be a separate entity entirely, something that comes from far away, passes through, and continues on its path. The multiplicity wasn't a problem for the Sumerians. Their cosmology was built to accommodate it, because the heavens themselves were multiple. This flexibility was not due to confusion or lack of understanding. On the contrary, the ancient Mesopotamians were some of the most precise sky watchers in history. Their astronomical records spanned centuries. They tracked Venus with astonishing accuracy. They understood lunar cycles and predicted eclipses. They weren't guessing when they looked up, they were calculating. But their calculations lived within a worldview where numbers and divinity coexisted, where the heavens had purpose, and where a single celestial phenomenon could wear more than one face. At times, this leads modern researchers into debates over what Nibiru meant in its original context. Was it a physical planet, a symbolic crossing point, a title for a known celestial object? The answer might very well be all of the above, depending on the era, the scribe, and the astronomical circumstances. The ancient cosmos wasn't static. It evolved as new observations entered the tradition, and each generation of priests inherited the interpretations of the ones before them. This layered sky also shaped their sense of cosmic order. The universe wasn't just a collection of balls of gas and rock orbiting a star. It was a structured realm of influence where each celestial body had a personality and a role. The planets were not merely objects, but figures in an ongoing narrative that played out both in heaven and on Earth. When a planet brightened, dimmed, sped up, or slowed down, those changes weren't seen as random. They were part of a dialogue. Nibiru, as the crossing point or the visiting world, became one of the most significant pieces of that dialogue. What made a wandering light significant wasn't only its movement, but the stories already embedded in the culture. When something unusual appeared, the priests connected it with memories of earlier appearances. They searched through old tablets for references. They recited hymns, myths, and histories. This act of connecting breaths across generations created a sense of continuity even when the phenomenon itself was irregular. That continuity allowed a single name to drift through centuries, occasionally assigned to new objects or circumstances, but always carrying the weight of its origin. The modern idea of Nibiru as a physical planet on a long, elongated orbit comes partly from interpreting these ancient layers through a contemporary lens. When someone today imagines a world that only appears every few thousand years, they picture ellipses, orbital mechanics, and gravitational perturbations. The ancients didn't think in these terms, but the concept aligned surprisingly well with their way of describing rare wanderers. A light that returns after centuries would naturally gain an identity, distinct from those that cycle predictably through the sky every year. And because the sky had room for many names, a traveller like Nibiru fit easily into the map. The universe was not limited to 7 known planets. There were realms beyond realms. The gods themselves came from heaven, but heaven was not a single place. It was a layered expanse filled with zones, routes, palaces, thresholds, gates, and crossings. A wandering world could move between these layers, bringing with it omens or revelations. In our current age, when the night sky is something glimpsed between streetlights and scarcely noticed, it's easy to forget how many meanings the heavens once held. For the people who relied on them to understand seasons, kingship, destiny, and the will of the gods, the sky wasn't just a backdrop. It was a living text, and every bright point was a word that could change. This makes the ancient world a fertile place for concepts like Nibiru to thrive. A planet that crosses into view after long eras resonates deeply in a cosmos defined by cycles and returns. The idea of gods coming from such a place aligns naturally with stories of divine descent, and the presence of numerous celestial names reflects a universe that was never closed, always open to new interpretations, new signs, new arrivals. Even today, when astronomers propose a possible 9th or even 10th planet far beyond Neptune, we're echoing the same impulse. The belief that the solar system might hold an undiscovered traveller is not a modern invention. It's a continuation of thousands of years of watching the sky and sensing that there is more out there than meets the eye. Somewhere between ancient stories and modern calculations, Nibiru remains suspended. A place that may never have been a single place. A name that never settled into one meaning. A wanderer in a sky full of wanderers. Whether it was a metaphor for cosmic transition or a memory of a rare celestial visitor, its presence in ancient culture reflects a time when the heavens were vast enough to hold mysteries without needing to resolve them. And as we drift forward, the sky still waits overhead, unchanged in its quiet rhythms, but changed forever in how we look at it. The ancients gave it names upon names, and even now, hidden worlds still tempt our imagination, reminding us that discovery doesn't only happen through telescopes. It also happens through stories quietly carried through time, each one pointing to the same enduring truth that the sky has always held more than we can see, and more than we can easily name. If the sky once carried more names than stars, then the earliest place those names settled into something permanent was a slab of wet clay under the hands of a Sumerian scribe. Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, long before parchment, ink or bound books, a person sat cross-legged on the packed earth of a temple courtyard and pressed the tip of a reed into soft clay. Each impression, tiny wedges arranged in patient patterns, became the symbols of a language that outlasted its cities. And among those thousands of marks scattered across centuries of tablets appears a word that still stirs curiosity today: Nibiru. The earliest cuneiform tablets weren't meant to preserve cosmic secrets. Many of them were little more than grocery lists, tax records, inventories of grain or goats. But over time, the same script was used for hymns, myths, royal decrees, astronomical observations, and long chronicles of events. When the word Nibiru appears in this sea of markings, it doesn't arrive with the dramatic flourish that modern imagination sometimes gives it. It enters quietly, like a whispered note in a larger conversation between the priests and the stars. To understand what that whisper meant, it helps to imagine what a Sumerian scribe knew. These were not casual observers of the heavens. They were trained in a tradition handed down across generations, a tradition in which astronomy, mathematics, literature, agriculture, and religion intertwined. A scribe wasn't simply a writer. He was a keeper of knowledge. His teachers had learned from theirs, and they from theirs, stretching back into a past that had already been old by the time the pyramids rose in Egypt. Somewhere in this long lineage, the idea of Nibiru emerged. Early texts hint that it had to do with crossing points, crossing paths, transitions. A star that appeared at a critical moment in the sky, a marker of change, a sign that something was shifting in the heavens above, and therefore in the world below. To the people of Mesopotamia, the sky was not separate from earthly affairs. When something moved above, it echoed below. And so, a crossing star was far more than a distant object. It was a message. One of the earliest references to Nibiru appears in a set of tablets collectively known as the Emul Apin. These texts, compiled around the first millennium BCE, but drawing on much older traditions, serve as an astronomical handbook. They describe star catalogues, planetary risings and settings, seasonal markers, and rituals associated with celestial events. Here, Nibiru is mentioned as a significant point, sometimes a star, sometimes a position, sometimes a symbol of transition. It was tied to the motions of Jupiter, but not limited to it. It was tied to Marduk, the great Babylonian deity, but older than him as well. The word travelled between meanings, just as the object or idea behind it travelled across the sky. The concept was flexible because the sky itself was flexible in ancient thought. The priests didn't see rigid classifications separating one celestial object from another. Instead, they saw functions, roles. A planet could be one thing in one season and another in a different season. A bright star could be the marker of a new year, or the omen of a king's fortune. When they looked up, they didn't see a map of isolated points. They saw a system of relationships, and Nibiru was part of that system. Over time, as cultural traditions shifted and cities rose and fell, the meaning of Nibiru evolved. The Akkadians inherited Sumerian ideas, adding their own interpretations. The Babylonians refined them further, bringing new gods, new rituals, new political meanings. When the Assyrians carved their own records, they too used the old terms but shaped them to suit their empire's needs. Across these cultures, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, the word persisted, changing slightly each time but retaining its aura of importance. This endurance is what makes Nibiru so interesting. There are many ancient terms that appear briefly and vanish. Nibiru did not vanish. It moved through time, carried by scribes who likely didn't know how enduring their work would become. The tablets they inscribed were baked by accident or by design, and buried in the ruins of temples and libraries. Millennia later, archaeologists uncovered them, brushed the dust away, and began the slow process of reading a language silent for centuries. When scholars first translated the cuneiform signs for Nibiru, they noticed its shifting meanings. In some passages, it refers to a celestial object associated with Marduk, suggesting a role of cosmic rulership. In others, it describes a specific point where stars rise or set during significant alignments. In still others, it seems almost like a title, a designation for whatever celestial body served as the crossing place during a given moment. This variability puzzled early translators, but for the ancients, it posed no contradiction. Their cosmos allowed fluidity. The modern desire to categorize and fix meanings didn't apply. It was only in the 20th century, when ancient texts were re-examined with modern assumptions, that the idea of Nibiru as a physical planet gained renewed attention. Those interpretations drew inspiration from the flexibility of the ancient term, but applied an entirely new framework: orbital dynamics, astrophysics, and the search for hidden worlds beyond Pluto. The old whisper became part of a new story. But before that transformation, Nibiru was simply a point in the sky that marked a shift, a transition, a crossing. To the Sumerians, who lived in a world where everything depended on the regularity of seasons, floods, and celestial cycles, these shifts had profound meaning. Their lives followed the rhythm of the rivers, their crops depended on predictable patterns, their cities thrived when kings listened to omens and failed when they ignored them. A word like Nibiru, tied to change, carried weight. The priests who recorded it weren't trying to create myths, they were trying to understand the world. They watched the sky every night, noting the behaviour of planets and stars with meticulous care. When something unusual happened, an alignment, an especially bright star, a deviation from expected paths, they logged it. And over time, patterns emerged. Some points in the sky were associated with turning points in the year or in the reign of a king. Some were tied to the flooding of rivers or the rising of crops. The consistency of these events gave rise to meaning, and meaning gave rise to names. The earliest appearance of Nibiru, therefore, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the arrival of a rogue planet. It wasn't a myth whispered about a far-flung world inhabited by powerful beings. It was a simple notation, a mark on a tablet describing a celestial moment. The significance came later, as centuries of observation layered interpretation upon interpretation. And yet, in those early whispers, something extraordinary lingers. The people who first wrote the word lived closer to the sky than we do. Their nights were filled with its light, their days guided by its patterns. They had no telescopes, but they had time. Endless time spent remembering, comparing and recording. Their observations were so long-term that modern astronomers still marvel at their accuracy. These were not people lost in superstition. They were early scientists, narrators of the heavens, weaving order into a cosmos they were just beginning to understand. It's easy to imagine a Sumerian priest explaining the concept of Nibiru to an apprentice. Perhaps he pointed to the horizon, where the glow of dawn was about to reveal a star in a position it had not held for many years. Perhaps he described it as a sign that a new cycle was beginning. Perhaps he recited an older hymn, written generations before, in which the crossing star marked the moment a god arrived or departed. To that apprentice, the meaning was not tied to the physical nature of the object, but to the role it played in the cosmic story. That role was what mattered. As centuries unfolded, the word travelled through time, acquiring layers like sediment. By the era of the Babylonians, Nibiru had become intertwined with Marduk, the central deity of their pantheon. In the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, Marduk triumphs over chaos and establishes order, assigning places to the stars. Later scholars linked Nibiru with the Star of Marduk, suggesting a celestial symbol of his authority. That connection strengthened the sense of Nibiru as a world of rulers, of divine power, of cosmic significance. But even here, the ambiguity persisted. It remained both a point and a place, a star and a crossing, a moment and a world. This openness allowed later interpreters to imagine Nibiru as a planet, one that occupied a distant realm, visited the inner solar system occasionally, and carried legendary beings with it. Those ideas weren't in the earliest Sumerian texts, but they resonated because the ancient term had never been rigid. Its original context left space for imagination. Still, the earliest whisper of Nibiru remains the most compelling. It reminds us that the ancients were not only myth-makers, but careful observers. They noticed something in the sky, a behaviour, a pattern, a transition that deserved a name. That name survived because it captured something essential about the way they understood the cosmos. It represented movement, change, and connection between realms. Whether it referred to a star rising at a particular time of year, or to a wandering light that appeared only rarely, it marked moments when the heavens shifted. And in a world where the sky governed so much, those moments mattered. The clay tablets that hold these whispers now sit in museums, far from the deserts where they were first inscribed. They are quiet, fragile, and unassuming. But when scholars read them, the voices of those ancient scribes return. The marks they pressed into clay with their reeds still carry the weight of their world, and somewhere in those markings Nibiru sits gently among other stars, one name among many waiting to be understood. In time, the whisper grew louder, shaped by myths, revisited by scholars, and eventually transformed by modern fascination. But in the beginning, it was only a small word on a clay tablet, marking a moment in the sky when something crossed from one realm to another. That moment echoed across civilizations, carrying with it the quiet suggestion that the universe is filled with travellers, both visible and unseen, both ordinary and extraordinary. And so the story continues, from a scribe in ancient Sumer to the endless night above us now, where hidden worlds may still drift beyond the reach of our eyes, waiting for their next crossing. Long before modern astronomy gave the sky its precise measurements and carefully plotted orbits, people watched the heavens with a closeness that's hard to imagine in a modern world filled with electric light. The night wasn't something glanced at through windows or from behind street lamps. It was a companion, a canvas, a steady reminder that life on Earth moved in a rhythm that matched the slow turning of the stars. And in that quiet, star-laden world, the ancients saw things move across the sky that didn't quite behave like the familiar planets they tracked so diligently. Those wanderers, with their unpredictable paths and long absences, left impressions strong enough to echo through thousands of years of stories, leading to ideas like Nibiru and the crossing it represented. When we picture ancient people watching the sky, it's easy to imagine something simple or primitive. But the truth is the opposite. Civilizations like the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians watched the heavens with such dedication that their observations still impress astronomers today. They charted the motions of planets and stars with remarkable accuracy, predicting eclipses, solstices, and conjunctions long before the mathematics of orbital mechanics existed. They weren't guessing. They were recording, comparing, and refining. And yet, even with all that care, the sky sometimes revealed things that did not fit into their neat cycles. The most striking of these were the objects that wandered differently than the known planets. A faint star that appeared on the horizon one season and vanished the next. A bright visitor with a tail that stretched across the night. A reddish glow that moved too slowly to be a meteor but too quickly to be a fixed star. Some of these were comets, some were novae. Some may have been planets observed in unusual circumstances, barely visible, or affected by atmospheric conditions. And some might have been rare alignments that tricked the eye into seeing movement where none existed. To the Sumerian astronomers, however, these phenomena seemed purposeful, intentional. They marked moments when the heavens shifted, when something crossed from one part of the sky to another and left behind a sense of change. This idea of crossing wasn't only about physical movement, it had symbolic meaning as well. The sky was divided into zones, each associated with specific constellations, gods, and earthly events. When a celestial object crossed from one zone to another, it was more than astronomy. It was a message, a transition between states, a sign that something significant was unfolding. Nibiru became the name for this concept of transition, the crossing place, the point where movement from one realm to another happened. Over time, the term came to be associated with a celestial body, sometimes Jupiter, sometimes a star, sometimes something else entirely. But behind all those interpretations lay the same idea. Something moved across the heavens in a way that set it apart from the ordinary cycles. The ancients didn't have telescopes, but they had patience. They could spend months tracking a faint speck of light that rose slightly earlier each night or drifted among the constellations in an unexpected pattern. They didn't see the sky as static. They saw it as alive, almost conversational. When an unfamiliar light appeared, they didn't dismiss it. They asked what it meant. They searched their older records. they consulted myths passed down from earlier generations. A new celestial visitor wasn't simply a rare event, it was part of an ongoing dialogue between humans and the universe. For example, when we look back at ancient records of what we now identify as Halley's Comet, we see how each civilization interpreted it differently. Some saw it as a herald of kings, others saw it as a warning, still others treated it as a divine messenger. The comet itself didn't change, but the understanding of it did. The same principle applies to Nibiru's earliest interpretations. The object or position associated with it was less important than the meaning attached to its movement. A crossing was a moment when the heavens signalled a transition, perhaps a political shift, a seasonal change, a major event, or a cosmic realignment. In some ancient records, the crossing is described not as a single event, but as a cycle, something that happened rarely, but predictably enough for memories of it to survive. A great star or point of light that reappeared after a long absence. To a society that tracked celestial events over generations, a rare visitor would stand out. Imagine a light that only appears once every few hundred years. No living person would have seen it before, yet the older tablets might describe something similar. The reappearance would feel momentous, almost supernatural. Those who saw it might believe they were witnessing a return, a reawakening of something ancient. This is where the modern idea of Nibiru as a long-period celestial body finds its roots. Although the original texts don't describe a planet on an elongated orbit the way modern interpretations do, the suggestion of a rare visitor, a wanderer who returns after long intervals, resonates deeply with that picture. Whether the ancients actually observed such an object or simply interpreted unusual lights through the lens of their cosmology, the concept of a crossing world took shape in their minds. That world didn't have to be a physical planet to function in their understanding. It was enough that something moved in a way that felt special. When the priests observed these movements, they didn't watch them in isolation. They connected them to earthly events. If a mysterious light appeared in the sky as a king ascended the throne, that connection became part of the story. If a crossing occurred near a drought or a flood, the meaning deepened. Over centuries, these associations layered on top of each other, creating a tapestry of interpretations. Nibiru grew from these layers, becoming a symbol much larger than any single astronomical event. This layering explains why the term resisted simple definition. It wasn't a single star or planet. It was a category, a phenomenon, a role that a particular object could fulfill under certain conditions. In some texts, Jupiter fulfills that role. In others, it's a star in the constellation of the Great Square. In still others, it seems to refer to a location in the sky rather than an object. Modern scholars debate these interpretations, but the ancient observers likely felt no confusion. They understood Nibiru not as a fixed identity, but as something that appeared when the heavens performed a certain action. It was the action, crossing, that mattered most. One way to understand this is to imagine standing in the middle of an ancient city at dusk. The heat of the day is fading. People are finishing their work. Lanterns are beginning to glow in doorways. Above you, the first stars appear. You know their positions as well as you know the layout of your own streets. You've seen them rise and set your entire life. But tonight, there's something different. A faint, reddish spark just above the horizon. You check your memory. You check your older tablets. It wasn't there last season. It doesn't match the patterns. You mark its position, wait a night, then another, then another. Slowly it climbs, drifting along a path that doesn't quite match any of the known wanderers. The scribes note it. The priests debate it. The city watches. A visitor like that, rare and unusual, would be woven into the understanding of the skies. And if it moved across a known boundary, between constellations or celestial zones, it gained even more significance. When something crossed into a new realm, it symbolized transition, change, something arriving or leaving. To a culture deeply attuned to the rhythms of the universe, that crossing was not random, it was meaningful. In time, These rare visitors would become part of legends. Stories would grow around them. Gods might be said to ride on them or to arrive with them. If a particular light appeared at the dawn of a golden age, it would be tied to prosperity. If it appeared before a time of difficulty, it might be remembered as an omen. Those stories would then influence how future generations interpreted similar events. The sky and human history became intertwined through repeated patterns, and Nibiru occupied a central place in those patterns. This intertwining helps explain why the concept of Nibiru became attached to divine figures like Marduk or Enki in certain periods. When a celestial crossing aligned with a narrative of gods descending or ascending, the association deepened. To the ancients, the heavens and the divine were inseparable. A rare visitor in the sky could easily be understood as a manifestation of divine movement. And if that visitor returned after long intervals, it fit naturally into cycles of myth involving gods who came, taught, ruled, and departed. From our modern perspective, shaped by centuries of science, it's easy to separate astronomy from mythology. But the ancients did not. They saw no contradiction in attributing both physical behaviour and divine intention to the same celestial object. A crossing star could be both an astronomical anomaly and a cosmological revelation. It could be part of the natural order and also part of a spiritual story about the origins of kings or the fate of empires. As we look back at what the ancients saw, it becomes clear that Nibiru was less about a specific object and more about the phenomenon of crossing itself. It represented moments when the sky behaved differently, when something entered or exited the familiar patterns. Those moments carried a sense of significance, sometimes subtle, sometimes profound. The ancients didn't need a distant planet to give Nibiru meaning. The meaning emerged from their own experience of the heavens. That longing to interpret the unknown, to connect cosmic movement with earthly life, hasn't disappeared. We still look up, still wonder about visitors from the outer reaches of the solar system, still speculate about hidden worlds that might drift beyond Neptune. The search for Planet 9 or Planet X echoes that ancient tradition. Modern astronomers use equations and simulations instead of clay tablets and omens, but the impulse is the same. Something in the sky moves in a way that hints at an unseen influence, and we give that unseen presence a name. Nibiru remains one of those names. Whether or not a physical world ever matched the ancient description, the concept captures a human experience older than written history. It reflects the moment when someone looked up and noticed that the sky had changed. A small motion, barely perceptible at first, but enough to stir curiosity and spark a chain of meaning that stretched across time. The crossing didn't have to be dramatic, it only had to be different. And in that difference, the ancients saw the universe engaging with them in a way that felt real, immediate, and powerful. Even now, thousands of years later, that feeling persists. A faint star on the horizon, a slow shift in a distant cluster, a newly discovered body in the outer solar system, all remind us of those early watchers who found wonder in the sky's every movement. They saw transitions where we see trajectories, messages where we see physics, but beneath the changes in language and worldview, the experience is the same. We are still looking for meaning in the heavens, we are still following the crossing, and as the story continues, the sky remains full of possibilities, some familiar, some hidden, some waiting to become the next whisper carried across generations. Across ancient Mesopotamia, the stories carved into clay speak of arrivals and departures that didn't follow the tidy patterns of the seasons, or the predictable sweep of the known planets. They speak of something that came from far away, lingered for a time, and then slipped back into the deep reaches of the sky. The idea of returners, beings or worlds that vanished and reappeared after long ages, wasn't unusual to people who believed the cosmos operated in cycles far greater than a single human life. The sky itself moved in long rhythms. Stars rose and set at different points in vast patterns that took generations to fully understand. In that world, a planet that came and went fit naturally into the cosmic order. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, the heavens were layered like a series of unseen realms. Some were the familiar pathways of the sun, moon, and planets. Others were deeper, darker, and further from the reach of human perception. These deeper zones were where the gods dwelled, where the great ancestral forces roamed, and where the most distant celestial bodies travelled. When something appeared in the sky that seemed to come from one of these remote zones and then depart again, it was understood as a visitor from a hidden part of the universe. That idea became central to the mythic character of Nibiru, especially as it evolved over centuries. In some traditions, Nibiru was connected to Marduk, the Babylonian deity who established order in the universe. In others, it was a wandering star or world that moved between realms, and although the ancient texts do not describe it with the kind of planetary detail modern narratives sometimes give it, they do give the impression that whatever Nibiru symbolized was not fixed. It came from somewhere far away, entered the familiar sky, and then receded again into areas that were largely unknown. The concept of heavenly returners wasn't limited to Nibiru. Comets were returners. Certain bright stars known to flare unexpectedly were returners. Even the planets, with their occasional retrograde motions, those strange backward loops against the starry background, could look like visitors that stepped briefly out of normal order before settling back into their paths. But Nibiru held a special place because its associations weren't only astronomical. They were cosmic, political, and spiritual. Imagine living in a city like Ur or Babylon where the night sky stretched overhead without any obstruction, where every star seemed sharper and closer than modern viewers would ever see. Nights were longer in many seasons, and without artificial light the darkness was full of quiet, uninterrupted clarity. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smear but a luminous river. The slow pulse of constellations was visible in their full patterns. Within that view, an unusual visitor, something faint, reddish, and slow, would draw attention immediately. If such a light drifted across the constellation where the path of the sun intersected with the path of other stars, it would be interpreted as a crossing, a transition between zones. If it appeared near the time of a king's ascension or a major seasonal shift, it gained additional weight. The myths grew naturally from these observations because for the ancients, the heavens were not separate from daily life. The lights above reflected the events below. When the gods departed or returned, the sky responded, and when the sky responded, the gods were thought to be at work. In this web of meaning, a rarely returning celestial visitor became a perfect symbol for divine movement. The gods came from distant realms, taught humans how to farm, govern, and write, and then withdrew. They weren't absent, just unseen, waiting for the right moment to return. That theme appears repeatedly in Sumerian myth. Deities like Enki, Ninurta, and Inanna have stories of departure and reappearance. Their movements mirror the movements of the sky, suggesting that divine cycles and celestial cycles were understood as one and the same. The concept of a returning world, then, wasn't an outlier. It was woven into the structure of their cosmology. Some stories describe gods descending in fiery craft, accompanied by roaring winds and blazing light. Others describe them arriving from the upper realm, a phrase that can be interpreted in many ways. Modern readers might hear echoes of spacecraft or distant planets, but to the ancient people, it meant something more fluid. The upper realm was both the sky above and the metaphysical plane where the gods lived. When something crossed into the visible sky from that realm, it was a sign of a divine return. Over time, these stories became so embedded in the culture that even natural celestial events could be interpreted as part of them. Distinct stars that brightened suddenly might be seen as returning. Comets arriving after long intervals could be viewed as emissaries. A peculiar planetary alignment might symbolize a moment when the boundaries between realms thinned. And because Nibiru was associated with crossing points, it took on the role of a returner in the largest sense possible, a world or star that appeared only when the universe shifted into a new phase. This idea was reinforced further by the Babylonian association of Nibiru with Marduk. In the creation myth, Marduk is described as establishing cosmic order after defeating a chaotic primordial being. After this victory, he assigns places to the stars, commands the motions of the heavens, and sets the cycles into motion. If Nibiru was connected with him, then it became part of the mechanism by which divine order asserted itself across the cosmos. A returning world would be a sign of that order renewing itself, but Nibiru's mythic character grew even more intriguing as later cultures expanded upon it. As time passed and new dynasties rose, the stories evolved. Scribe after scribe added details, reinterpreted old lines, or connected ancient terms to new ideas. The idea of returning worlds took on layers of meaning, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, depending on the needs of the moment. During turbulent periods, such as invasions, droughts, or political shifts, the returners might be framed as omens. In more stable times, they might represent cycles of renewal. The concept also found fertile ground outside Mesopotamia as ideas spread along trade routes. Egyptian, Anatolian and Persian astronomers developed their own ways of interpreting wandering lights. The Greeks, and later the Romans, added their perspectives, blending Mesopotamian observations with their own myths. Somewhere in this broad tapestry of interpretation, the idea of a long-period celestial visitor gained resonance across cultures. Many mythologies include stories of worlds or islands that disappear for long ages and then re-emerge. Some describe stars that appear only at the beginning or end of ages. These worldwide themes suggest that humanity has long been fascinated by the idea of something hidden returning unexpectedly. Modern readers often wonder whether the ancients actually saw a physical planet move across the sky in a way that suggested a long orbit. The evidence from the clay tablets doesn't support that interpretation directly. The texts don't describe a large visible world sweeping through the heavens, but they do describe events that could be connected to rare celestial phenomena, bright long-tailed comets, novae, or even planetary conjunctions that created the illusion of a single unusual object. These events, combined with a worldview that linked celestial movement with divine presence, shaped the idea of a visitor from the deep sky. At the same time, there's an argument to be made that the ancients might have encountered something so rare that it didn't fit their usual categories. Even modern astronomers occasionally observe events that challenge existing models. A stellar flare bright enough to be seen only once in thousands of years. A distant asteroid orbiting in a way that suggests a gravitational influence from something unseen. A slow-moving comet whose orbit is so elongated that it disappears into darkness for millennia. To ancient observers, any of these could have appeared as a returning world. One of the reasons the idea of a physical returning planet has persisted into modern times is that our own solar system still contains mysteries in its far regions. Beyond Neptune and Pluto lies an enormous zone filled with icy bodies, drifting in orbit so long that they take tens of thousands of years to complete a single revolution. Anything wandering in that region could remain unseen for entire human civilizations. Even if it drifted closer on rare occasions, atmospheric haze or fleeting periods of visibility could easily shape how it was interpreted. The ancients might not have had the tools to identify what they were seeing. They only knew that something unusual moved through the heavens and then vanished again. These rare appearances likely inspired the sense that some celestial bodies were not permanent members of the familiar sky, but guests passing through. Some myths describe their return as bringing wisdom or upheaval. Others describe them as heralds of divine presence. Still others treat them as markers of cosmic cycles, signs that a hidden order is at work behind the stars. As the centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the stories blended into new interpretations. The idea of returners survived long after the original events that inspired them had faded from memory. Scribes in later eras read older texts and interpreted them through their own cosmologies. Some saw the returners as literal celestial bodies. Others saw them as metaphorical. The flexibility of the idea allowed it to persist. In more recent history, the concept of a returning planet gained new life when researchers proposed the existence of long-period celestial objects far beyond Pluto. Some astronomers noticed patterns in the orbits of distant icy bodies, suggesting an unseen mass tugging on them from the dark. This unseen influence revived the notion of a hidden world that returns periodically to the inner solar system. Although modern models describe this hypothetical world in terms of gravity, mass, and elliptical orbits, the idea resonates with the ancient stories in surprising ways. The ancients and modern observers are looking at the same universe through different lenses, but the attraction to mysterious returners remains the same. In this convergence of old myth and new science, Nibiru holds a curious place. It is both a symbol and a possibility, a relic of ancient cosmology and a reminder of how vast and unexplored the solar system still is. Even though the ancient texts do not describe a returning planet in modern terms, the myths surrounding Nibiru have absorbed that idea because it fits naturally into the ancient pattern of visitors from the deep sky. As we trace the concept through time, we see that the ancient watchers weren't just imagining. They were responding to real astronomical events, interpreted through their world view. That world view gave meaning to rare celestial visitors and transformed them into symbols of divine movement, cosmic renewal, or impending change. The world they lived in encouraged such interpretations because life itself was shaped by forces that often seemed unpredictable and beyond control. By the time Nibiru became part of modern imagination, shaped by books, discussions, and speculative theories, it had already spent millennia evolving through interpretations. The returners from the deep had travelled a long way from the first faint lights observed by Sumerian astronomers. And yet, the essence is the same, an awareness that the sky contains wanderers whose paths stretch far beyond the limits of human life, whose appearances spark fascination, and whose disappearances invite curiosity. Even now, as modern telescopes scan the outer solar system, that curiosity persists. The sky remains a place of mysteries that come and go, some easily explained and others still waiting for context. And in that quiet expanse, the old stories of returners still echo, inviting us to look beyond what we can see and imagine what might drift toward us from the deep once again. When we follow the stories of Nibiru back through time, through the shifting meanings and the quiet movements of unfamiliar lights across the sky, we eventually reach the figures who shaped the earliest cosmology of Mesopotamia. These were not abstract forces or distant symbols. They were personalities woven into the rhythm of nature and the ordering of the heavens. And among them, two names rise again and again, their presence felt across myths, hymns, royal inscriptions and celestial interpretations, Enki and Enlil. To the people who first recorded the concept of a crossing world, these gods were not just rulers of realms. They were caretakers of cosmic order, custodians of the transitions between states, the very definition of what the ancients understood as lords of the crossing. To understand their connection to the idea of Nibiru, it helps to picture the world in which their stories took shape. The earlier cities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were surrounded by landscapes that changed dramatically with the seasons. Floods came without warning in some years and failed to come at all in others. Crops thrived in fertile years and withered in times of drought. Political power shifted among city-states as quickly as the rivers carved new channels. In such a world, the forces that shaped the environment seemed alive, purposeful, and unpredictable. The gods were expressions of that environment, but they were also stewards of the unseen mechanisms that lay behind it. Enki, the god of water, knowledge, creation, and the deep, represented the quiet forces that nurtured life. His domain was not the loud crash of storms or the blazing heat of the sun, but the slow, steady currents of rivers, the hidden springs underground, and the subtle flow of wisdom that guided humanity. Enlil, by contrast, embodied authority, the command of the wind and the breath of storms. His power was abrupt, decisive, and often overwhelming. While Enki ruled through guidance, creativity, and problem-solving, Enlil ruled through decree and force. Together they represented a balance that mirrored the visible and hidden movements of the heavens. The ancient Sumerians didn't conceive of the sky as separate from these divine personalities. The movements of stars, the risings of planets, and the occasional appearance of unusual celestial visitors were extensions of the gods themselves. A bright star that rose at the beginning of the year might be described as a sign of Enlil's favour. A mysterious wandering light that drifted into view at a moment of crisis could be seen as Enki's intervention. In this context, the idea of a crossing star or world was more than a physical phenomenon. It was an expression of divine will moving through the heavens. Over generations, these connections solidified. Nibiru, as a concept relating to transition, became associated with the gods who oversaw those transitions. Some texts tie the idea directly to Marduk, who inherited elements from both Enki and Enlil in later Babylonian theology. But the roots of that association lie deeper, in the older stories of Enki as the wise mediator, and Enlil as the forceful ruler of the sky. When the heavens shifted, one or both of them played a role. When something returned from the deep sky, it reflected their cosmic authority. One of the most revealing parts of this link comes from the language used in the ancient hymns. Enlil is sometimes called the Lord of the Air and the Decider of Destinies. Enki is the Lord of the Abyss, the Keeper of Secrets, and the Bringer of Arts and Civilization. These titles align with the roles often attributed to Nibiru in later interpretations. Nibiru is sometimes described as a place of command, a point where decisions are made about the order of the heavens. Other times it is a portal, a crossing point from the deep to the visible world. These roles mirror the contrast between Enlil's authority and Enki's hidden knowledge. If Nibiru represented the crossing, then Enki and Enlil were its presiding figures. To the ancient people, these gods were not distant abstractions. They were the forces that made rivers rise, crops grow, storms break, and civilizations flourish. Their stories weren't just tales. They were frameworks for understanding how the world worked. When something unusual appeared in the sky, when a rare visitor glowed faintly on the horizon, drifting between constellations, the meaning of that event couldn't be separated from the personalities who governed cosmic motion. A return from the deep sky wasn't just an astronomical moment. It was a divine visitation, a sign that the cosmic order was shifting. This view of the universe transformed the movements of celestial bodies into expressions of divine cycles. The known planets each represented powerful deities. The sun was Utu or Shamash. The moon was Nana or Sin. Venus was Inanna or Ishtar, depending on the era and region. Jupiter was associated with Marduk, Ma'es with Nergal, Saturn with Ninurta. In this worldview, a celestial visitor like Nibiru wasn't simply another planet. It was something larger, a symbol of divine presence passing between realms. The ancient stories describe Enki and Enlil as having complementary but sometimes opposing roles in shaping human destiny. Enlil often appears as the strict ruler, the one who enforces order and delivers judgment. Enki appears as the mediator, the one who softens harsh decrees and helps humanity survive challenges. These roles are echoed in myths like the Flood story, where Enlil decides to wipe out humanity, but Enki intervenes to preserve life by guiding a chosen figure through the disaster. This story, older than the biblical account by many centuries, shows how the ancients saw their gods as intimately connected to the cycles of destruction and renewal, cycles reflected not only on Earth, but in the sky. In some interpretations of the myths, the gods themselves are described as coming from a distant realm. The term heaven can refer to the sky above, but it also refers to a deeper domain, a place outside the ordinary world. When stories speak of gods descending to Earth or returning to their heavenly homes, the language echoes the idea of celestial bodies moving into visibility and then receding again. The boundary between mythological realms and astronomical regions was thin. A god's departure into the deep sky could correspond to the disappearance of a faint celestial visitor. A god's arrival could align with its reappearance. To the ancients, these connections weren't speculative. They were part of the fabric of their understanding. This blending of cosmology and theology created a universe where the gods were not only metaphysical beings, but also celestial presences. Enki and Enlil were not merely rulers of realms. They were the forces behind the movements of the heavens. The concept of a crossing point, a moment when the sky's unfamiliar realms became visible, fit naturally into this structure, and so Nibiru became associated with these divine figures, not because the texts describe it explicitly as their home, but because the concept of crossing belonged to the gods who governed transitions. In later centuries, when scholars revisited the ancient tablets, the associations deepened. The idea of Nibiru as a world inhabited by gods who came to Earth resonated strongly with the stories of divine descent found throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Enki's interactions with humanity, teaching crafts, devising irrigation, guiding early kings, fit seamlessly into the idea of beings arriving from afar. Enlil's role as the one who governs destiny matched the concept of a world that carries cosmic authority. These parallels weren't part of the earliest texts in the literal sense, but they aligned so well with the symbolic meanings that the two interpretations blended. And so, as modern interpretations began to imagine Nibiru as a physical world with its own civilizations, the roles of Enki and Enlil became intertwined with that vision. Whether taken metaphorically or speculatively, the idea of the Anunnaki as beings who travelled between a distant world and Earth mirrors the ancient stories of gods descending from the sky to shape human history. The idea of a world that comes and goes, visible only at intervals, mirrors the ancient concept of returners. The idea of a crossing point where decisions are made about the order of the cosmos mirrors Enlil's role as the decider of destinies. These parallels don't prove that the ancients saw a physical planet orbiting on a long trajectory, but they do show how the concept of Nibiru became a bridge between myth and observation. The gods who moved between realms, the celestial visitors who appeared and disappeared, the stories of departures and returns, all these elements created a cosmological landscape in which the idea of a wandering world made perfect sense. To the people who created these stories, the sky wasn't a separate scientific domain. It was the living expression of divine will. When something crossed from one realm to another, it wasn't random. It meant something, and that meaning shaped everything from their political decisions to their agricultural practices. Even now, when we read these ancient stories through modern lenses, the personalities of Enki and Enlil still carry a sense of presence. Enki remains the figure of hidden knowledge, depth, and quiet intervention. Enlil remains the figure of authority, order, and powerful change. Their dynamic reflects the dual nature of any crossing, one part revelation, one part upheaval. A return from the deep sky might bring wisdom, or it might bring challenge, and both possibilities lived in the stories of the gods. The ancients didn't separate these concepts because their world didn't require such separation. They understood the universe as a coherent system where divine will, celestial movement, and earthly events aligned. Something crossing into the visible sky was a sign that the boundary between realms was shifting. And so the stories of Enki, Enlil, and the crossing became expressions of how they made sense of those changes. As we move from these mythic layers into the later interpretations of Nibiru, the influence of these gods remains. Their presence shapes how the stories evolved. Their roles define the meaning of the crossing. Their long arcs through myth mirror the imagined arcs of a world that comes and goes. And through all of it, the quiet truth remains that the earliest watchers saw the sky as a place of arrival and departure, guided by beings whose stories still linger in the clay today. In the oldest layers of Mesopotamian stories, beneath the hymns and royal inscriptions, behind the genealogies of gods and the rituals carved into temple walls, there lies a quiet thread that carries the idea of purpose. the gods did not appear in the world without reason. They arrived with intention, acted with direction, and left traces of their motives in fragments of myth. Over time, those motives became part of the stories that later generations tried to weave together, creating a picture of why divine beings would descend from the heavens to walk among humans. In the centuries that followed, especially in the readings that interpreted Nibiru as a world inhabited by the Anunnaki, this purpose became known as the Golden Need. Gold appears frequently in ancient texts, not only as a precious resource but as a symbol of divine essence. The temples of Sumer, Akkad and Babylon treasured it, not simply for wealth or ornamentation, but because it was associated with immortality, purity and divine radiance. Even the gods themselves were described as shining like gold. Kings were adorned with it to align themselves with the heavens, and ceremonial statues glimmered in the light of oil lamps because gold carried the meaning of celestial perfection. In that world, the metal represented something more than earthly value. It represented a kind of cosmic necessity. Later interpretations, shaped by modern lenses, reimagined this necessity not only as symbolic but as literal. In those readings, the Anunnaki arrived from a distant world because they needed gold for their own survival. Their home, sometimes linked to the concept of Nibiru, was said to require the metal to maintain a stable environment. The story suggested that gold could repair atmospheric damage or regulate climate conditions on their remote planet. And while the earliest texts do not describe these details directly, the idea grew out of the sense that the gods came with purpose, and that gold had meaning far beyond human use. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, gold's importance wasn't limited to ornamentation or currency. They used it in rituals, in statues meant to house the presence of gods, and in the decoration of temples that connected earthly life with the divine realm. Its rarity made it holy. It resisted tarnish, making it a symbol of permanence in a world where almost everything was vulnerable to weather, time, and war. When the gods in the myths were described as luminous beings, their light was often compared to gold. The association tied the metal directly to divinity, making its presence in the world a reflection of celestial origin. This connection may explain why later interpreters linked gold to the arrival of divine beings from the sky. If gold symbolized the essence of the gods, then a world rich in gold would be a natural place for them to visit or influence. Some narratives suggested that gold on Earth was a resource the gods needed, either for survival or for the maintenance of cosmic order. The idea of mining undertaken by divine beings or their emissaries became woven into these interpretations, reinforcing the image of the gods as visitors who came not only to teach and guide, but also to gather a precious element for their own world. To understand the foundation of this idea, we can look closely at how the ancient myths describe interactions between gods and humans. In many stories, the gods create humans from clay, or shape early people into more capable beings by granting them knowledge, language, and crafts. Enki, the god associated with wisdom and creativity, is often at the centre of these tales. He helps humans survive floods, teaches them irrigation and agriculture, and guides early kings in establishing laws. His role suggests that humans were created not to worship blindly, but to participate in the maintenance of order. They were helpers, caretakers, and partners. This concept of partnership aligns with the later reading that human beings were created or shaped to help the gods with labour, especially the gathering of resources like gold. In those interpretations, the gods needed a workforce, and so modified or uplifted early humans to suit that purpose. Again, this isn't stated explicitly in the earliest texts, but the mythological patterns point toward a relationship shaped by shared purpose. The gods required something from Earth, and humans became part of the process of obtaining it. When viewed through the ancient lens, the golden need becomes both symbolic and functional. Symbolically, gold represented the divine nature that the gods brought with them and bestowed upon certain chosen humans, especially kings. Functionally, gold was a resource tied to ritual practices, temple construction and the maintenance of the physical expressions of divine presence. Even if the earliest people didn't imagine the gods needing gold for their own atmosphere, they still saw gold as part of the connection between heaven and earth. Its acquisition was an act of linking the two realms. This connection appears in stories that describe the gods descending to earth, building cities, and establishing sacred sites. The temples themselves were viewed as places where the heavens touched the ground. They weren't merely structures for worship, they were bridges between realms. Gold was used extensively in these structures, reinforcing the idea that it served not only practical or decorative purposes, but also symbolic ones. It helped create a space suitable for divine presence, a place where earthly materials could reflect celestial reality. Over time, as later cultures and interpretations layered their own meanings onto these stories, gold became a focal point for understanding why the gods came. The idea resonated because it made sense both in mythic and symbolic terms. The gods were beings of light and radiance, associated with the sun, stars, and the glittering sheen of gold. Their arrival on Earth aligned with the discovery and use of gold by humans, and their departure left behind the memory of a resource that always pointed back to the sky. The golden need, therefore, becomes a narrative that bridges the ancient and modern understandings of divine arrival. It acknowledges that the gods did not descend arbitrarily. They had reasons rooted in their own nature and the functioning of the cosmos. Whether those reasons were symbolic or practical, the stories suggest a purpose beyond simple curiosity or visitation. The gods came because the world held something essential to them, something that tied earth and heaven together. This idea also reflects a broader pattern in mythological storytelling. Across cultures, divine beings often bring technology, agriculture, writing, or wisdom to humanity. They are depicted as teachers, not as distant observers. They shape early civilizations, guiding them through the challenges of forming stable societies and enduring in difficult environments. These patterns mirror the Mesopotamian stories in which Enki and other gods provide humanity with tools necessary for survival and cultural development. The stories tie the arrival of divine beings to the advancement of human knowledge. That advancement went hand in hand with the discovery of metals. The earliest civilizations placed enormous value on gold, silver, copper, and later iron, not only for practical use but for symbolic power. Metalwork was seen as a divine gift, a skill that elevated human society beyond simple survival. In myths from many cultures, the gods teach humans how to work metal. In the Mesopotamian tradition, craftsmanship and technology fall under the guidance of deities who interact closely with human artisans. The connection between metal and divinity deepened over centuries. Gold, as the most resistant to decay, became the metal most closely linked to immortality and divine nature. Because it didn't rust, fade, or tarnish, it seemed removed from the normal processes of earthbound materials. Its permanence made it a natural symbol for cosmic stability. In that symbolic language, the golden need was not just a function of material scarcity. It reflected a deep metaphysical relationship between the gods and the world. Modern interpretations that imagine the Anunnaki mining gold for technological or atmospheric purposes may represent a reimagining of that symbolic relationship. In this version, gold becomes not only a divine symbol but a literal necessity. The gods need it for the survival of their own world, and their arrival on Earth becomes part of a cosmic cycle of resource gathering. This interpretation ties together the ancient associations of gold with divinity and the modern understanding of metals as components in advanced technologies. While the ancient texts never describe these technical details, the myths leave space for such interpretations because they repeatedly emphasize that the gods came to Earth with purpose. They establish cities, teach crafts, intervene in human affairs, and guide early rulers. The stories read like accounts of beings who brought knowledge from afar, shaped early societies, and then withdrew when their goals were met. That pattern naturally invites speculation about what needs those goals might have served. Seen in this light, the Golden Need becomes a narrative that shaped how people understood their relationship with the gods. Humans worked with metals, built temples, created objects of worship, and offered gold to the gods in rituals. These acts were not only expressions of devotion, but parts of a larger cosmological purpose. The gold offered to the gods returned to the heavens in symbolic form, reinforcing the idea that the resource belonged to divine realms. As the myths continued to evolve, later cultures expanded on these associations. The idea of powerful beings descending from the sky to acquire resources or guide humanity appears in traditions far beyond Mesopotamia. Some describe gods arriving on fiery chariots. Others depict them as luminous beings who came to teach and then left. Many include references to precious metals as gifts from the gods or as substances connected to their presence. These patterns do not prove literal events, but they do show that the ancient world shared a common understanding of metal as something that connected Earth with heaven. Over time, this shared understanding contributed to the idea that the gods might have required gold in ways humans couldn't fully grasp. The metal's association with divine presence made it natural to imagine that it served a function in the realm of the gods. And because the earlier stories of Nibiru described a visitor from a distant region of the sky, the two ideas merged into a narrative that placed gold at the centre of the god's arrival. The Golden Need remains one of the most compelling parts of the Nibiru narrative because it taps into both ancient symbolism and modern imagination. It reminds us that the stories of divine visitors weren't random. They were woven from observations of the sky, from encounters with rare celestial events, and from the discovery of materials that seemed to hold traces of divine light. And as these stories moved through time, they lodged themselves in the imagination of every generation that read them. The idea of gods descending to Earth with purpose, motivated by a need tied to cosmic order, remains powerful because it reflects a timeless question about why the sky and the earth are so deeply connected in our oldest myths. The Golden Need is one way of answering that question. Quietly, slowly, with a sense that the universe moves according to patterns that remain partly visible and partly hidden, just like the faint visitors that drift across the night sky and disappear again into the deep. When ancient people spoke of Nibiru, they weren't only talking about a distant light in the sky or a mysterious crossing point on a celestial map. They were also remembering something, some impression, some echo, some event that left enough of an imprint that whole cultures felt it linger across centuries. The origin of that memory didn't have to be precise in their minds. It simply needed to feel significant. And in the ancient world, significance wasn't measured by scientific definitions, but by the weight of change. Anything that shifted the order of the heavens, even briefly, became part of the story of how the world itself had been shaped. For the oldest civilizations of Mesopotamia, the sky was not a silent expanse. It was active, full of motions and signals that shaped the rhythms of life. People depended on the reliability of the heavens for planting, travel, religious festivals, and even political decisions. When something unusual appeared above them, it had the power to alter not only the night's view, but the emotional atmosphere of entire cities. This is the world in which the idea formed that something once came close enough to be felt, not necessarily in a physical way, but in a way that deeply affected memory. If we follow this thread back through the myths, we find repeated stories of moments when the boundary between the heavens and the earth seemed thin, times when the gods walked among humans, taught them skills, reshaped landscapes, or established new forms of order. Some of these stories appear in the earlier Sumerian writings. Others come from Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions. But all of them point to a belief that the divine realm did not remain distant. It crossed into the human world when the cycle required it. Those crossings were often accompanied by celestial signs. The idea that Nibiru once touched the earth does not appear in literal form in the earliest translations. Instead, it emerges through layers of symbolic meaning, astronomical interpretation, and the way ancient record keepers connected natural events to divine activity. For them, an object entering the inner sky was not simply a visitor, it was a participant in the fate of the world. If it was rare enough, brilliant enough, or timed closely to a major change in human history, then its memory became inseparable from the events themselves. Imagine a time thousands of years ago, long before formal history, when early communities watched a strange light grow brighter over nights, lingering just long enough to cause wonder or concern before fading again. Without the ability to describe or measure it as we do today, people interpreted it through the framework they had. Stories of gods who travelled between realms. A celestial visitor could easily be understood as the return of a divine being, or the sign of one arriving soon, or a message from a hidden world. If that period also coincided with a flood, a drought, a migration, or a shift in rulership, the memory of the event would become fused with the memory of the visitor. The Epic of Gilgamesh, older than most surviving myths, describes a world that had already endured great upheavals when its stories were first carved into clay. The flood narrative, the interactions with gods who descend from the sky, and the mentions of distant realms all reflect a belief that the past was marked by moments of drastic change. Later readers looked at these ancient stories and connected them to the idea of Nibiru's approach. If a rare cosmic visitor aligned with a memory of catastrophe or transformation, it made sense to imagine that the visitor had directly influenced the world. Some interpretations have proposed that when Nibiru came near the Earth in deep antiquity, it caused significant shifts, floods, earthquakes, or atmospheric changes. These ideas are part of later readings rather than direct translations, but they resonate with the ancient mindset because the earliest myths describe an environment prone to destruction and renewal. Floods especially shaped the identity of Mesopotamian cultures. They weren't occasional disasters. They were life-defining events that erased whole landscapes. To explain them, people looked to the heavens, expecting to find a reason written there. In that sense, the memory of Nibiru touching the Earth becomes a symbolic way of saying that the heavens once played a more active role in shaping life. Whether the ancients saw an unusually large comet, a rare conjunction, a supernova, or some celestial event lost to time, the impact it made was strong enough to inspire stories that lasted for millennia. The idea that a world entered the inner realm of the sky and influenced the earth below became a natural extension of that experience. In some traditions, the gods are described as arriving on celestial boats or brilliant chariots. In others, they descend in whirlwinds or storms of fire. These descriptions may represent symbolic language, but they could also reflect memories of phenomena that appeared sudden and dramatic to ancient eyes. A bright visitor in the heavens, leaving a trail or emitting unusual light, would easily inspire imagery of a fiery descent. Even if it remained distant physically, the impression it made could be interpreted as a direct interaction with the earth. The role of memory here is important. Ancient societies transmitted their stories orally for generations before they were written down. Over time, memories of real events took on mythic qualities, blending factual experiences with cultural interpretations. A celestial event that caused widespread wonder or fear could become a story of the heavens approaching the earth. When later generations read those stories, they saw descriptions that felt literal. Modern interpreters then took those literal readings and imagined a physical world with an elongated orbit passing through the solar system. The result is a tapestry of ideas in which memory, astronomy, myth, and speculation overlap. Nibiru touching the Earth becomes less about physical collision and more about contact. Cosmic contact experienced through environmental changes, divine narratives, or unusual atmospheric events. The ancient flood stories provide a particularly strong example of how these elements intertwined. In the Sumerian flood myth, the gods decide to cleanse the world with a great deluge, but Enki intervenes to save one human, ensuring survival and continuity. The Babylonian and Assyrian versions contain similar themes. When these narratives were later connected to the idea of Nibiru, the suggestion arose that the flood may have been triggered by the approach of a celestial body. Whether this reflects a real event or a symbolic merging of natural disasters with astronomical memory, the connection shaped how people understood the role of the heavens in human history. Even if the flood was purely terrestrial, caused by seasonal extremes, shifting rivers, or climatic shifts, the ancients would have understood it within a cosmic framework. Everything that happened on Earth reflected movements in the sky. If a celestial visitor appeared near the time of a flood, the two experiences became linked in the collective memory. This blending created the foundation on which later interpretations built the idea of Nibiru touching the Earth. Another aspect of the memory involves the role of the Anunnaki, often described as descending at times when the Earth needed guidance. These stories portray moments when the gods directly intervened in human development, introducing technologies, laws, and agricultural methods. These interventions were associated with celestial events, reinforcing the idea that the arrival of divine beings was marked by changes in the sky. When these narratives were read through the lens of a physical world approaching the Earth, the gods' arrival became part of the larger Nibiru cycle. In many myths, the gods are depicted as leaving the Earth abruptly. Their departure is often associated with destruction, upheaval, or changes in the environment. The memory of their leaving mingled with the memory of celestial movements, creating stories of a world receding into the deep sky after accomplishing its purpose. When interpreted through the idea of Nibiru, these departures became part of a larger cosmic cycle in which the hidden world approaches, interacts, and then retreats again. The idea of Nibiru touching the Earth, then, reflects a deeper understanding of how ancient people interpreted the world around them. They lived in a landscape shaped by unpredictable rivers, sudden storms, and dramatic seasonal shifts. They believed that the heavens governed these changes, so any unusual celestial event held immense significance. When something appeared in the sky that was rare enough or bright enough to draw attention, it became a sign of divine involvement. Memory preserved the emotional truth of these events, even if the scientific details weren't known. This emotional memory is what gave the idea of Nibiru its lasting power. It wasn't a simple story told once and forgotten. It was part of a larger tradition in which the movements of the sky explained the movements of history. Civilizations rose and fell. Floods erased regions. Empires expanded and collapsed. Through it all, the heavens provided context. Something rare and luminous could be remembered as a world. Its return could be remembered as a moment when history shifted. Even today, the idea that a distant world might influence life on Earth resonates because we still live with the same sense of wonder. We may understand gravity and orbital mechanics, but there is still something awe-inspiring in the idea that hidden realms exist just beyond what we can see. Modern observations of distant trans-Neptunian objects echo the ancient belief that the solar system contains more than its familiar members. Something unseen still tugs at the edges of our maps, just as something unseen tugged at the imaginations of the first people who watched the sky with careful eyes. The idea that Nibiru once approached the Earth, leaving behind a memory strong enough to influence myth and culture, lives in this space between observation and meaning. Whether the event was literal or symbolic, physical or mythic, the memory remains. It is preserved in the stories of gods who arrive from the sky, in the myths of floods that reshape civilization, and in the ancient descriptions of a crossing world whose influence was felt more than understood. And as the cycle of storytelling continues, the memory continues with it, inviting each generation to look up and imagine what might once have drifted through the inner sky, bright enough to change the way humans saw the universe and their place within it. In the long drift of ancient memory, some events stand out with such intensity that they shape the stories of entire civilizations. When people across centuries whispered about a time when the heavens shifted and the world trembled under forces greater than any king or army, They weren't just speaking about seasonal storms or the ordinary troubles of early cities. They were remembering something that felt immense, something that arrived with a sense of inevitability, leaving both ruin and insight in its wake. In the traditions that later became connected to Nibiru, this moment took the form of a cataclysm followed by a covenant, a pattern in which destruction made way for renewal and divine presence reshaped the world. The idea of a cosmic visitor whose last approach brought upheaval is not found explicitly in surviving tablets, but the emotional outline of such a memory appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian legend. Floods that swept away entire regions, winds that tore across fields with unnatural force, periods when the natural rhythms of life seemed to fracture. These events became tied to celestial movements because the people who lived through them believed that the heavens guided every change on Earth. When disasters struck, they searched the sky for explanation. If something unfamiliar had appeared there, some wandering light or rare visitor, memory would remember them together. This blending of natural events and celestial phenomena is what allowed the idea of a cataclysm caused by a returning world to take shape centuries later. The oldest stories describe cycles in which the gods decide to alter the fate of humanity. Sometimes the change arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives as a tidal shift. But in every version, it leaves the world different than before. That difference carried such weight that it shaped the mythology long after the details were forgotten. The Mesopotamian flood story provides the clearest example of this pattern. The clay tablets recovered from sites like Nineveh and Nippur contain accounts of a world overwhelmed by waters so vast that even the highest mountains were hidden. This was not a simple flood or a seasonal overflow. It was a global erasure from which only a single figure survived with his family and the seeds of life. The reasons for this destruction vary from one version to another, but the theme remains consistent. Something immense descended upon the earth, washing away what had existed and allowing a new beginning to form. When these stories were connected centuries later to the idea of Nibiru, the flood became part of the narrative of a planet's last visit. The idea suggested that the approach of a large world could trigger tidal disruptions or shifts in the atmosphere, causing catastrophic events that became mythologized as divine judgment. Whether or not the ancients ever witnessed something that could match such a scenario, their memories of catastrophe were vivid enough that later interpretations easily wove them into the Nibiru tradition. Yet the flood was not the only event remembered with this intensity. There were also stories of years when the winds roared for months, carrying sand and heat across fertile lands. Years when crops failed without clear explanation, forcing migrations that reshaped political boundaries. Years when the sky darkened with ash from distant volcanic eruptions, creating sunsets that seemed touched by otherworldly colours. Each of these experiences left a mark on the collective memory. When future generations looked back at those periods, they interpreted them as moments when the cosmic order had been disrupted. In a world where the gods represented the forces behind nature, such disruptions were understood as signs that the gods had intervened directly. If the intervention was destructive, it reflected a divine decision to cleanse or reset the world. And after such events, myths often describe a covenant, a renewed agreement between gods and humans about how the world should function. This pattern appears not only in the flood story but in many others. The old order ends, catastrophe arrives, a new order emerges. The connection to Nibiru grew from these cycles. If a celestial visitor marked a change in the world, then the last time it came close would naturally be remembered as a moment of upheaval. And if the tradition included the idea that the gods departed after fulfilling their purpose, then the disappearance of that celestial visitor would become part of a narrative of withdrawal. The world was touched once, changed, and left with a new covenant that guided future generations. The idea of a covenant in Mesopotamian myth does not resemble the formal agreements found in later religious traditions. It is not described as a written contract or a set of commandments. Instead, it appears in the way the world is said to function after the catastrophe. The flood story, for example, ends with the gods realizing that humanity must not be erased completely. They swear to allow life to continue and create new patterns to reduce the need for such destruction. Seasonal cycles change, lifespans shorten. The boundaries between gods and humans become more defined. These changes form the covenant, an understanding of how the world will work from that point forward. If such an agreement followed a period of upheaval, then the idea of a world approaching the earth and then withdrawing fits naturally as well. A celestial body that comes close enough to be seen with unusual clarity stirs the imagination, aligns with a time of crisis, and then vanishes into the deep sky would leave behind both fear and reverence. Generations later, those feelings become myth. The world changed when that visitor came. The covenant that followed became part of the new order. One of the most compelling parts of this tradition involves the role of Enki. In almost every version of the flood story, Enki acts as the protector of humanity, whispering warnings, offering guidance, and ensuring that at least one person survives. His compassion and foresight shape the outcome of the catastrophe. In later interpretations, Enki becomes linked to the idea of beings who arrive from a distant world with knowledge and technology. If Nibiru symbolized their home, then its last visit would naturally include moments when Enki guided humanity through the upheaval. Enlil, on the other hand, often appears as the force that brings about the destruction. In the flood story, he is the one who initiates the deluge, angered by humanity's noise, behavior, or growth. He seeks to restore order by wiping the world clean. After the disaster, he participates in the covenant to reshape the relationship between gods and humans. This duality, destruction followed by restoration, matches the emotional arc of a world whose approach brings fear, then change, then renewal. When these roles are placed alongside the idea of Nibiru, the cataclysm becomes not only an environmental event but a spiritual one. The return of the world from the deep sky signals a shift in the cosmic balance. The disappearance of the world signals a return to stability, and the covenant establishes the rules for life until the next shift. Other cultures in the region preserved memories of similar cycles. The Hittites, Egyptians, and early Hebrews all described periods when the world nearly ended, followed by moments of covenant or divine instruction. These similarities suggest that ancient peoples across wide regions experienced significant environmental events that left lasting impressions. Whether the disasters were caused by shifting climate patterns, volcanic eruptions, or rare celestial events, their memories were strong enough to form the foundation of age-defining myths. To later interpreters, these similarities hinted at a single large-scale event, a catastrophic approach of a hidden world. The idea suggested that Nibiru's orbit brought it near the solar system only rarely, and that its last passage coincided with the great upheavals remembered across ancient stories. This interpretation was not based on direct textual descriptions, but on the emotional resonance of the myths. Something happened, something enormous, something that reshaped the world, and that something was remembered long after the details were forgotten. In this way, the cataclysm and the covenant became connected to the imagined cycle of Nibiru's visits. If a world entered the inner heavens only once in many ages, then its last approach would mark a turning point, a shift in the cosmic order, a new beginning for humanity. The stories of floods, migrations, and divine instruction all reflect this pattern. What makes this tradition particularly enduring is the way it blends fear and guidance. The cataclysm is not remembered only as a tragedy. It also carries the sense that humanity was not abandoned. The gods did not leave the world in ruin. They ensured that life continued, that knowledge survived, and that humans had the tools to rebuild. This sense of resilience shaped the covenant that followed the catastrophe. It gave ancient people a way to understand why the world had changed and why they needed to adapt. Over time, as these stories passed from one culture to another, The idea of a distant world approaching the Earth became increasingly associated with the idea of cycles. The world comes close, brings change, and then retreats. The pattern repeats after long ages. This cyclical understanding of history was common in ancient thought. Time was not linear, it was circular, it returned to itself. When people looked back at their myths, they saw not only isolated events but a repeating rhythm. Nibiru became part of this rhythm in later interpretations. Its last visit marked a cataclysm. Its next visit, imagined far in the future, would mark another turning point. The covenant established after the last cataclysm set the conditions for the world until the next cycle began. Humanity's role was to live within that covenant, guided by the wisdom left by the gods. Even now, when the ancient stories are read through modern eyes, the emotional resonance of the cataclysm and the covenant persists. It speaks to a deep human understanding that cycles of destruction and renewal shape the world. Civilizations rise and fall. Natural disasters reshape landscapes. New eras begin after old ones end. These patterns continue to influence how people interpret their place in the universe. The idea of Nibiru's last visit embodies this understanding in a cosmic frame. It reflects the belief that the universe itself participates in the cycles of life, that distant realms influence the Earth in ways felt more than understood, that the sky holds memories of times when everything changed, and that somewhere in those memories lies a covenant, a quiet sense that the world moves according to patterns older than history and larger than any single civilization. The stories preserved in clay capture that feeling with remarkable depth. They do not describe the cataclysm directly as the approach of a hidden world, but they describe a moment when the heavens and the earth felt inseparable, when divine presence touched human life in a way that left a lasting imprint, when the world was reshaped and then renewed. Those memories, carried through time, became part of the narrative of Nibiru, reminding each generation that somewhere in the long cycles of the cosmos, the universe leaves marks on the world that endure long after everything else fades. As the ancient stories settled into the clay of early civilizations, their echoes remained long after the cities that shaped them had risen and fallen. When modern scholars first brushed the dust from the tablets of Mesopotamia, they stepped into a world that understood the heavens in ways both unfamiliar and strangely resonant. The people who carved those symbols believed the sky revealed more than simple patterns of seasons and stars. It held memories, cycles, and a language known only to those patient enough to watch. They didn't describe their world with equations or instruments, but they did something equally profound. They observed with an intensity born of necessity, curiosity, and reverence. When those early translators encountered terms like Nibiru, they recognized that the ancients were pointing to something that moved differently from the rest of the known sky. Its meaning was layered and fluid, connected to gods, seasons, cycles, and rare celestial visitors. That fluidity made it difficult to define, and in time, the ambiguity itself allowed new interpretations to take root. As scholars compared different tablets, cultures, and astronomical lists, they found hints of patterns that seemed to stretch across generations. And in the gaps between those patterns, the modern mind saw possibilities that the ancient scribe may never have imagined. The search for Planet X, a hypothetical world lurking beyond the orbit of Neptune, began not in myth but in mathematics. In the 19th century, astronomers noticed deviations in the motions of Uranus and Neptune that suggested the presence of another massive object, exerting gravitational influence. These irregularities sparked curiosity, inspiring decades-long efforts to find something invisible that seemed to tug on the outer planets with quiet persistence. This was not a search for a mythic world or a legendary home of gods. It was a search driven by numbers, predictions, and the belief that the solar system still held secrets at its borders. As astronomers charted the orbits of distant bodies with increasing precision, they began to suspect that something large might be lurking in the cold dark beyond Neptune. The search eventually led to the discovery of Pluto in 1930, a moment celebrated as proof of the mathematics that had predicted a missing world. But the triumph didn't last. Pluto turned out to be far too small to account for the gravitational anomalies. It was a piece of the puzzle, not the missing giant. The echoes of something unseen still lingered in the equations. While astronomers grappled with these uncertainties, scholars studying the ancient world were facing their own tantalizing gaps. The cuneiform tablets contained lists of stars, planets, and celestial phenomena described with surprising detail. Many of these aligned well with modern astronomy. But a few references stood out, especially those connected to the word Nibiru. Some passages described it as a position in the sky, others linked it to Jupiter, others connected it to Marduk, and a few, interpreted through specific lenses, seemed to hint at something that came and went, visible only under certain circumstances. These overlapping interpretations created an intriguing parallel. On one hand, astronomers were searching for a hidden world whose presence was felt but not yet seen. On the other, scholars were deciphering texts that appeared to describe a mysterious celestial visitor with a cycle beyond ordinary observation. The two searches, though separated by millennia and methodology, drifted toward one another like distant bodies caught in mutual gravity. The link between the ancient Nibiru and the modern Planet X didn't originate in academic circles. It grew within the quiet space where speculation meets curiosity, where old stories are re-examined with new questions, and where people try to reconcile the vastness of the universe with the fragments of knowledge left by earlier civilizations. Readers who encountered both the ancient references and the modern mathematical predictions saw connections that scholars themselves approached cautiously. They wondered whether the ancients had observed something rare, perhaps something that passed through the inner regions of the solar system so infrequently that it became encoded in myth rather than catalogued in cycles. From a scholarly perspective, the ancient texts do not describe a physical planet returning at long intervals in the way modern interpretations imagine, but they do describe rare celestial visitors, unusual alignments, and transitions marked by the term Nibiru. These descriptions leave open enough interpretive space that the idea of a hidden world could be woven into them. The ancient skywatcher might not have known the difference between a long-period comet, a bright transient event, or the distant glimmer of a hidden world. All could become part of the memory preserved in clay. While scholars debated translations, astronomers continued refining the search. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new telescopes and digital sky surveys revealed a vast population of icy objects beyond Neptune, a region now known as the Kuiper Belt. Among these distant bodies, patterns emerged. Clusters of orbits tilted strangely, extended far from the plane of the planets, and grouped in ways that suggested gravitational influence from something massive. This evidence revived the idea of a ninth or even 10th planet. Unlike earlier searches, this one wasn't based on discrepancies in the known planets, but on the behaviour of the distant, icy objects drifting far beyond Pluto. Their orbits were not random. They seemed to curve and cluster as though shepherded by something unseen. Some astronomers proposed that a large planet, perhaps several times the mass of Earth, orbited the Sun on an elongated path extending hundreds of times farther than Neptune. Such a planet would take thousands of years to complete a single orbit, appearing only briefly in the region where modern telescopes could spot it. The idea was compelling because it matched the kind of long, slow cycles described in the myths. A world that remained unseen for centuries could easily become a symbol of rare cosmic events. If ancient skywatchers saw even the faintest glimmer of such a body, they might interpret its arrival as a divine crossing. And because their stories often blended physical observation with spiritual meaning, the visitor could take on the attributes of a god or a sign sent by one. To modern astronomers, this hypothetical world, sometimes called Planet 9, is grounded in physics rather than myth. It would be cold, distant and slow-moving, with no direct influence on Earth other than the subtle tug it exerts on the outer solar system. but the idea still resonates with people who read the ancient texts, the same way rare alignments and celestial visitors resonated with those who carved stars into clay. The universe hasn't changed, only our understanding of it has. As the search for Planet X evolved, scholars studying ancient Mesopotamia found themselves in quiet conversation with astronomers, even if the two disciplines never formally overlapped. Both groups were trying to understand patterns across long stretches of time. One read the motions of distant icy bodies, the other read symbols pressed into clay thousands of years ago. Both were dealing with incomplete information and gaps that invited interpretation. Both stood at the edges of what was known, looking for the hidden shapes that influenced what they could observe. The echoes in clay, as scholars described them, were not literal descriptions of a distant planet. They were reflections of how ancient people interpreted the uncommon. A bright, slow-moving visitor could remain in cultural memory long enough to be woven into myth. A rare event visible for a few nights could become part of a cosmic narrative. Even if the event itself was natural, the meaning attached to it was profound. And when later readers encountered these stories, they found enough ambiguity to imagine that the ancients had witnessed something extraordinary. Meanwhile, astronomers uncovered more evidence suggesting something large might still be out there. Mathematical models simulated orbits of distant objects, assuming a massive planet's presence. The results aligned. The unseen body was not proven, but the idea gained traction. Some sky surveys narrowed the possible regions where such a planet could be hiding. Others expanded the search to higher inclinations, considering the possibility that the planet's orbit might tilt differently from the familiar solar system. The more astronomers searched, the more the outer solar system seemed like a place where hidden worlds could still drift unnoticed. Even in an age of satellites, advanced telescopes, and sky mapping software, large regions of the sky remain too vast and too faint to examine thoroughly. A planet with a distant, slow-moving orbit could hide for centuries in patches of darkness where no survey has yet looked. The ancient sky watchers understood this instinctively, though in a different way. They believed that the sky held realms beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Some zones were familiar and predictable. Others were hidden and home to forces they called divine. A celestial visitor crossing from one realm to another could be interpreted as a sign that the universe had shifted. These interpretations carried into myth, and myth carried into symbol. The echoes of those symbols lingered in clay, waiting to be rediscovered. As scholars translated more tablets, they found that Nibiru had multiple meanings depending on context. It could be a star, it could be a position in the sky, it could be Jupiter, it could be a symbolic crossing, it could be a representation of divine authority. None of these interpretations solidified Nibiru as a physical planet, but none of them ruled out the possibility that rare celestial visitors had influenced early cosmology. The ambiguity left space for speculation, and that speculation intertwined with the modern search for Planet X. For some observers, the parallels between the ancient memory and the modern hypothesis are more than coincidence. They see the ancient descriptions as early attempts to record something real, a celestial visitor whose orbit carried it so far from the sun that it vanished for generations. Whether such a world exists or not, the possibility creates a bridge between the ancient and modern ways of looking at the sky. It suggests that the universe is larger than the systems we map, and that memory preserves hints of what early people once saw. For scholars grounded in textual analysis, the echoes in clay reflect something different. They show how ancient people made meaning from the unfamiliar. When the sky presented something rare, uncertain, or dramatic, the interpretation became part of their mythology. Those myths shaped their identity, influenced their rituals, and informed their understanding of why the world changed. The celestial visitor became a symbol rather than a literal object, a reflection of transitions rather than an astronomical event. Both perspectives carry truth in their own ways. The astronomer's truth is rooted in physics, observation, and the search for evidence. The scholar's truth is rooted in language, culture, and the interpretation of memory. The fact that these two truths intersect in the idea of a hidden world says more about human curiosity than it does about any specific celestial body. People have always looked outward for meaning. They have always tried to connect the movements of the heavens to the movements of their own lives. As the modern search for Planet X continues, it carries forward this ancient tradition in a new form. Telescopes sweep across the sky, scanning regions so dark and distant that even light feels slow there. Software simulates orbits on computers that hum with calculations. Data from probes at the edge of the solar system hints at gravitational forces that haven't yet been traced to a visible object. Somewhere in the cold beyond Neptune, something may still drift, unseen but influential. And whether that something is found or remains hidden, the search itself reflects the same instinct that drove early people to carve star charts into clay. The universe is wide. It leaves signs at its edges. Some are clear, some are faint. Some take thousands of years to reveal themselves. And in those long intervals between appearances, stories form, symbols form, echoes form. The ancient clay tablets are part of those echoes, preserved across the rise and fall of empires. The modern astronomical models are another kind of echo, shaped by equations rather than mythology. Together they tell a story of how humanity continues to look outward, searching for the hidden influences that guide the heavens. Whether Nibiru was a symbolic crossing or a memory of a distant world, the impulse behind the story remains the same. It is the desire to understand what moves in the dark beyond our sight, and how those movements shape the rhythms of the world below. And as new discoveries emerge from the farthest regions of the solar system, those echoes grow louder, reminding us that the boundary between what is known and what is imagined has always been a place where memory and curiosity meet, shaping the way we understand the sky, the past, and the universe that still surrounds us with mysteries waiting quietly in the dark. As the story of Nibiru drifted from myth into modern curiosity, it entered a realm shaped not by clay tablets or wandering lights, but by telescopes, simulations, and the cautious language of research. Scientists studying the outer reaches of the solar system were not looking for the home of ancient gods. They were looking for patterns, small, quiet hints that something unseen was influencing the motions of distant objects. Their work unfolded slowly, guided by equations rather than myths, but in its own way, it shared a similar sense of looking into the unknown. The sky remained a place where mysteries lingered, even if those mysteries were now described in the vocabulary of physics. Beyond Neptune lies a region where sunlight is weak and the cold is so intense that even the dust moves sluggishly. This is the Kuiper Belt, a vast, scattered realm of icy worlds drifting in silence. Some of these worlds are only a few dozen kilometers across. Others, like Pluto and Eris, rival the size of Earth's moon. Together they form a population that orbits the sun in paths tilted and stretched by forces that scientists are still trying to understand. When astronomers first began mapping this region in detail, they expected randomness. Instead, they found patterns. Certain Kuiper Belt objects were grouped together in oddly similar orbits. Their elongated paths pointed in nearly the same direction. Their alignment suggested they were being shepherded by something large, something far more massive than any of the known dwarf planets. This was the beginning of a new hypothesis, one that revived the dormant idea of a hidden planet, but without the mythic qualities that surrounded Nibiru. Scientists called it Planet X, Planet 9, or sometimes simply the Perturber, a placeholder name for an unseen mass influencing the outer solar system. The idea was not welcomed easily. Throughout the 20th century, Planet X had become a recurring theme in astronomy, rising and falling in credibility as new discoveries reshaped the solar system's map. When Pluto was found, it seemed like the mystery was solved, but calculations showed that Pluto wasn't massive enough to explain the motion of the outer planets. Later refinements revealed that earlier measurements of Uranus and Neptune had errors, reducing the need for a hidden world. By the late 20th century, Planet X had become a faint echo of its former self. Interesting, but mostly relegated to the margins. Then the Kuiper Belt changed everything. As more objects were discovered, the patterns became too consistent to ignore. Some astronomers argued that the clustering could be coincidence. Others suggested observational bias. Perhaps telescopes were simply more likely to find objects in certain regions of the sky. But repeated analysis showed that the likelihood of pure chance was low. Something seemed to be shaping the far reaches of the solar system, and that something was large. Modern scientists are careful with ideas like this. They do not claim discovery until evidence is overwhelming. They simulate orbits, refine their predictions, and search systematically. Their skepticism is not dismissive, it is foundational. It keeps the search grounded, ensuring that each step forward is measured and reliable. In this environment, the idea of a distant planet took shape slowly, reinforced not by excitement, but by repeated mathematical consistency. Even so, the hypothesis carries a sense of wonder. A planet several times larger than Earth, orbiting so far from the Sun that 1 year might last 10,000 of ours, drifting through a region so cold that its atmosphere would collapse into ice. That image captures the imagination of both scientists and the public. This is not the fiery, divine world of the ancient myths. It is a silent, frozen giant moving through the shadows of a realm few had imagined before modern telescopes revealed its existence. Still, the scientific perspective does not erase the sense of mystery. If such a world exists, it would sit at the edge of the known solar system, far beyond the reach of spacecraft, faint enough that even powerful telescopes might miss it, unless they look in just the right place. Its orbit would take it through regions where stars are dense and background noise is high, making detection even more difficult. It could be positioned near the galactic plane, hidden by the light of distant suns. The search continues, not as a race but as a slow, methodical effort, with each new sky survey narrowing the possibilities. Meanwhile, skepticism remains strong. Some scientists argue that the clustering of Kuiper Belt objects might be due to the structure of the early solar system rather than a present-day planet. Others suggest that unseen interactions between many small objects could produce the same patterns. A few propose that the gravitational tug comes from something even more exotic, such as a cloud of small bodies we have not yet mapped. In every case, the arguments are careful, respectful, and grounded in evidence. This interplay between possibility and skepticism mirrors the dynamic of myth and interpretation in the ancient world. The people who carved star lists into clay didn't record every light they saw. They recorded the ones that mattered to them. Their interpretations were shaped by the stories they inherited, just as modern interpretations are shaped by models and data. Both systems try to describe something larger than themselves. Both systems carry echoes from one generation to another. As astronomers debate whether Planet 9 truly exists, they continue to refine their methods. They simulate thousands of hypothetical orbits, adjusting mass, distance, inclination, and eccentricity to see which combinations produce the patterns observed. They evaluate new data from surveys conducted with enormous telescopes in Hawaii, Chile, and space. They use infrared instruments designed to detect faint heat signatures from distant objects. They explore regions of the sky previously ignored because of technical limitations. In the midst of this search, one thing becomes clear. The outer solar system is not empty. It is structured, shaped, sculpted by influences we have not fully mapped or understood. Even if Planet 9 is never found, the process of searching has revealed a dynamic region full of objects that challenge our understanding of how the solar system formed. Their orbits hint at collisions, migrations, and interactions that occurred long before humans took their first steps. The shadows beyond Neptune hold a history that is still unfolding through calculations, observations, and theories. For scholars studying ancient Mesopotamian cosmology, The scientific search has an interesting parallel. The ancients also believed that the regions beyond the familiar sky held forces that influenced the world. They described these regions as realms of gods, thresholds between worlds, or zones where celestial visitors originated. Their language was symbolic rather than mathematical, but their instincts recognized a truth modern science confirms: the heavens are not static. They contain layers, surprises, and cycles that reveal themselves slowly over time. The caution that scientists bring to the search for Planet X resembles the caution scholars bring to interpreting ancient texts. Translating cuneiform requires careful attention to nuance, context, and multiple meanings. A single term can shift depending on the time period, the scribe, or the surrounding lines. The same is true for astronomical models. Small errors in measurement can lead to large differences in interpretation. In both fields, humility is essential because the unknown vastly outweighs the known. What fascinates many observers is the way these two realms, ancient mythology and modern astronomy, occasionally brush against each other. The myths speak of a crossing world. The science speaks of a hypothetical distant planet. The myths describe cycles of appearance and disappearance. The simulations describe orbits of extreme length. The two are not the same, but they resonate in a way that suggests why the idea of a hidden world has endured across millennia. As the search continues, scientists remain aware of how easily excitement can outpace evidence. They publish cautiously, mindful that every claim must withstand scrutiny. Their skepticism is not opposition but discipline. It ensures that when something extraordinary is finally confirmed, it rests on solid ground. The shadows beyond Neptune still hold that possibility. Each year, new sky surveys increase the chances of spotting something faint, slow, and distant. Each discovery of a new extreme Kuiper Belt object refines the models that predict where a hidden planet might be found. In time, the search will either uncover a new world or reveal that the patterns arise from something more subtle. Either outcome will deepen our understanding of the solar system. Through it all, the idea of something waiting in the distant dark remains compelling. It is not a threat or a source of fear, but a reminder that the universe is wider than our maps. The ancients saw the sky as a living realm filled with signs that shaped their world. Modern astronomy sees it as a physical space governed by laws that we strive to understand. Between these perspectives lies a shared curiosity that has never faded. As long as the shadows beyond Neptune remain uncharted, there will be room for wonder. The sky still contains horizons we have not crossed, and the world still holds mysteries that connect the past to the present in silent, steady ways. Whether Planet X exists or not, the search reveals something important about the human spirit, that we continue to look outward, patiently, carefully, always listening for the faint signals that hint at what lies just beyond our reach. Long before observatories rose on mountaintops and spacecraft drifted through the outskirts of the solar system, the first astronomers were farmers, priests, and wanderers who lifted their eyes each night toward a sky that turned with a reliability nothing else in their world could match. The rivers shifted, the seasons varied, the winds brought both life and destruction. But the heavens moved in patterns so steady that they became the earliest form of memory humanity ever created. In that distant time, people did not understand the sky as a separate realm of physics and cold distances. They saw it as a reflection of the world below, a living map of cycles, destinies, and stories that shaped their understanding of time itself. When they carved symbols into clay tablets or etched lines into stone, they were not simply recording observations. They were preserving the way the sky had spoken to them. Their maps captured constellations, patterns of rising stars, and the slow drift of the planets as they wandered against the steady backdrop of the night. These maps became part of how ancient civilizations understood their place in the universe. They served as calendars, agricultural guides, ritual markers, and histories written not with words but with stars. As modern scholars uncovered these ancient records, They noticed something remarkable. Despite their age, many of the star lists and celestial descriptions matched modern astronomy with surprising accuracy. The people who created them did not possess telescopes or advanced instruments, but they paid attention with a level of dedication that left an enduring mark. Their sky was the same one we see now, but their interpretation of it blended observation with meaning. They saw symbols and signs where we see objects and forces, and in their maps, they embedded not only the stars they recognized, but the stories they believed those stars carried. Some of the earliest surviving maps come from Mesopotamia, where priests used the movements of the heavens to track seasons, predict floods, and align their temples with specific celestial events. These priests observed the planets with care, noting the moments when they slowed, reversed direction, or vanished behind the sun. They named stars with meanings that reflected their culture's values and fears. They recorded eclipses with a precision modern scientists can still verify. And through all of this, they left behind hints of something more elusive, a sense that the sky itself carried memories older than humanity. This idea appears in the way they described rare celestial visitors. When something unusual entered the sky, even briefly, it stood out against the familiar motions. A bright star where none had been the night before, a faint glow moving slowly across the horizon, a comet whose tail stretched across half the sky. These events were woven into stories that survived long after the events themselves faded from memory. In some cases, these stories became part of myths involving gods, creation, destruction, and renewal. In others, they became signs used to mark the beginning or end of eras. One of the most intriguing aspects of these ancient maps is the way they blend precise observation with symbolic interpretation. A star might be described with mathematical detail in one line and divine qualities in the next. A planet's movement might be noted with exact timing, but its significance would be explained through myth. This blending makes it difficult for modern readers to interpret the ancient records strictly through a scientific lens. The ancients were not cataloguing the sky in the way modern astronomers do. They were building a system of meaning that connected the heavens to everyday life. When later readers encountered references to Nibiru in these texts, they saw different possibilities depending on the interpretive lens they used. To some, Nibiru represented a specific planet moving through a known section of the sky. To others, it represented a crossing point, a place where celestial movement shifted. To others still, it symbolized a rare visitor that appeared only under certain conditions. The ambiguity allowed room for speculation, and as modern science revealed new mysteries at the edge of the solar system, those interpretations began to overlap in interesting ways. This convergence became more prominent when astronomers started mapping the distant Kuiper belt and the even more remote scattered disk. The objects found there moved in ways that hinted at unseen influences, inviting comparisons to ancient descriptions of celestial crossings. Scholars noticed parallels, not literal matches but echoes, between the ancient idea of rare visitors and the modern idea of distant bodies whose orbits stretched far beyond the familiar planets. These parallels did not prove that ancient people knew about distant worlds like Planet 9, but they showed that both ancient and modern minds recognized that the sky contained depths not easily explained. As more ancient maps came to light, particularly those from Babylonian and Assyrian archives, researchers found patterns that reflected an astonishing level of astronomical knowledge. The cycles of Venus, Jupiter and Mars were tracked with accuracy that suggested centuries of careful observation. Eclipses were predicted using methods that remain impressive even now. The ziggurats, built with stepped terraces reaching upward, functioned partially as observatories, giving priests as clear a view of the horizon as possible. These structures allowed them to observe the rise and set of stars with a consistency that shaped both their calendars and their myths. One of the most fascinating features of the ancient sky maps is the way they tracked long-term cycles, movements that take decades or even centuries to complete. The precession of the equinoxes a slow drift in the sky's alignment caused by the Earth's wobble, was not understood explicitly by ancient cultures, but they noticed its effects. Constellations that marked the seasons shifted slowly over generations. Myths tied to those constellations shifted with them. The sky carried a memory of change, and the maps reflected that memory in subtle ways. When modern researchers read these ancient maps, they sometimes encountered descriptions that seemed to reference events outside the ordinary cycles. A star said to appear only once in a vast span of time. A planet described in language that doesn't match any known object. A crossing that marks the transition from one age to another. These descriptions often resist simple interpretation, but they hold an emotional truth that resonates with the way early people understood the sky. Rare events were not forgotten. They were anchored in memory through story, ritual, and repetition. And when those memories were later written in clay, they became part of the ongoing conversation between humanity and the heavens. Modern mysteries add another layer to this conversation. As astronomers uncover new objects in the distant solar system, they find patterns that defy easy explanation. Some objects have orbits so elongated that they spend thousands of years in darkness before briefly approaching the inner solar system. Others travel in inclinations that tilt far from the familiar planetary plane. A few appear to be shepherded by unseen influences, their paths bending in ways that hint at something massive beyond our current maps. These discoveries revive the idea that the solar system contains unseen realms, just as the ancients believed. But the modern approach is grounded in measurement, simulation, and observation rather than symbolism. Astronomers plot orbital paths with mathematical precision, comparing each new find against existing models. They adjust their equations to account for slight variations in speed, distance, and momentum. They use infrared surveys to search for faint heat signatures. They analyze data from sky surveys covering millions of stars. With each new discovery, the picture grows more complex. And yet, despite the difference in tools and language, the impulse behind the search is familiar. The ancients mapped the sky to understand their world. Modern astronomers map it to understand the universe. Both groups are responding to the same sense that something important lies in the patterns above them. Both see the sky as a place that holds answers to questions they cannot express fully. Some of the most interesting mysteries lie in the regions where the ancient maps and modern discoveries seem to overlap in spirit, if not in detail. The ancients described thresholds in the sky, zones where the familiar gave way to the unfamiliar. In the modern view, the Kuiper Belt and the scattered disk serve as such thresholds. They mark the boundary between the solar system we understand well and the regions where our knowledge becomes sparse. Beyond them lies the Oort cloud, a hypothetical sphere filled with icy bodies that drift so far from the sun that even starlight can barely reach them. Scientists believe that this remote reservoir holds the origins of long-period comets, some of which return after tens of thousands of years. If any part of the modern sky holds the kind of rare visitor the ancients described, it would be here, in these distant, quiet realms. The ancient maps were not literal depictions of space, but they reflect an awareness that the sky contains layers. Some images show constellations with symbolic meaning. Others depict paths that planets follow over time. A few show crossings, points where celestial movements intersect in ways that mattered deeply to early astronomers. These crossings could mark the beginning of seasons, the return of a god, or the start of a cycle of renewal. In later interpretations, these crossings were associated with Nibiru, not as a specific world, but as a moment of transition. The modern understanding of orbital resonances and gravitational interactions mirrors this recognition in a different way. The outer solar system is full of crossings, paths that intersect, influence one another, and reveal hidden patterns. As scholars and astronomers continue their work, both fields contribute to a more layered understanding of the universe. The ancient maps remind us that human curiosity stretches back farther than any modern instrument. The modern discoveries show that the universe is still full of mysteries waiting to be unlocked. Together, they create a picture of the cosmos that is both ancient and modern, shaped by memory, observation, and a sense of wonder that has never faded. The sky remembers what passes through it. The ancients marked those memories in clay. The modern world marks them in data sets and simulations. The methods are different, but the impulse is the same. Something moves out there in the quiet dark. Something shapes the edges of our solar system. Something influences the dreams, fears, and curiosity that guide our gaze upward. And as we continue to map those distant regions, both through the stories of the past and the instruments of the present, the sky remains what it has always been. A vast, patient archive of everything that has ever crossed it, waiting for those who take the time to read its patterns and trace the quiet motion of mysteries that drift just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The story of Nibiru has travelled a long distance across time, moving from ancient clay tablets through centuries of interpretation, eventually settling into the modern world, where it now sits at an unusual crossroads. On one side, there is myth, carrying memories of rare celestial visitors and the cycles that shaped the earliest civilizations. On the other side, there is mathematics, tracing subtle patterns in the outer solar system and searching for forces that can't yet be seen. Between these two realms, the idea of a hidden world continues to exist, not as a certainty, but as a possibility that lingers in the quiet spaces where science meets imagination. The ancient stories left behind descriptions of a crossing, a rare event in the sky that marked transitions, upheavals, or the arrival of divine presence. These stories did not define Nibiru in a single way. The term shifted across contexts, sometimes referring to Jupiter, sometimes to a position in the heavens, sometimes to a star or planet associated with a god. What remained consistent was the sense that Nibiru marked a boundary. It was a symbol of movement between realms, a moment when something distant became visible and then retreated again. This fluid meaning allowed it to survive long after the civilizations that first shaped it disappeared. Centuries later, when scholars began translating the ancient tablets, they found these descriptions fascinating. But they also found them ambiguous. The texts were not astronomical manuals in the modern sense. They blended observation with symbolism, ritual, and cosmic order. Interpreting them required an understanding of the ancient worldview, where the sky was not a separate domain but part of the same fabric that governed floods, kingships, and the cycles of life. In that worldview, rare celestial events were not random. They carried meaning that shaped decisions and stories. Modern astronomy approaches the sky with different tools and different expectations. It searches for mass, motion, and measurable influence. It studies orbits, gravitational fields, and the thermal signatures of distant objects. But even with all these tools, the outer solar system remains difficult to map. Vast regions beyond Neptune are still only partially explored. The light is faint. The objects are tiny. Their paths take thousands of years to reveal themselves. The mathematics that describes their motion can hint at something unseen, but it cannot confirm it without direct observation. This is the environment in which the idea of a hidden planet has taken shape in scientific circles. The possibility of a distant world several times the mass of Earth, orbiting far beyond the known planets, is not a product of myth, but of physics. It arises from the unusual clustering of certain Kuiper Belt objects, their elongated orbits bending in ways that suggest a large influence lurking in the outer dark. This hypothetical world, sometimes called Planet 9, does not match the mythic descriptions of Nibiru in detail, but it resonates on a deeper level. It represents the idea that the solar system contains more than the familiar 8 planets and the smaller bodies we have mapped. The question of whether Nibiru still exists is not one that science answers directly. Instead, science asks whether a distant planet exists, one that might align with the broad idea of a hidden world with an enormous orbit. In the ancient texts, Nibiru is not defined as a specific physical planet in the way modern astronomy uses the term. It is defined through context, symbolism, and meaning. Yet, the possibility of a distant world touches the same part of human curiosity that inspired the ancient stories. The idea that something could drift at the edge of the solar system, unseen but influential, connects old and new perspectives in a quiet, almost poetic way, even if the interpretation itself remains grounded in measurable patterns. The challenge in exploring this possibility lies in the difference between how myth records memory and how mathematics records data. Myth captures emotional truth. It remembers events not as measurements, but as turning points. A flood becomes a story of divine intervention. A bright celestial visitor becomes a sign of change. A moment of crisis becomes a shift in cosmic order. The details blur across generations, but the impression remains. Mathematics, in contrast, demands precision. It does not rely on emotional significance. It requires numbers that match observable reality. If a planet exists, it must influence the motion of other bodies in predictable ways. Its orbit must fit within calculations. Its position must be narrowed by simulations. Despite their differences, the two approaches share something important. Both recognize that the sky contains mysteries not easily understood. For ancient people, those mysteries were encoded in stories that shape their identity. For modern astronomers, the mysteries appear in residuals, small deviations in orbital paths that can't be explained by current models. These deviations might be errors, coincidences, or signs of something more substantial. Until the evidence becomes clear, the possibility remains open. If we consider the ancient perspective first, the idea of Nibiru surviving into the present carries weight because the myths describe cycles that extend far beyond a single lifetime. They speak of worlds that appear only at long intervals, of ages divided by celestial movements, and of gods who arrive and depart across spans of time that no human can observe fully. These cycles were not understood as precise orbits. They were understood as rhythms of existence, guiding the rise and fall of civilizations. In that sense, Nibiru still existing is less about a planet and more about the idea that the universe continues to move, in patterns that may one day bring something rare into view again. From the scientific perspective, the question becomes one of probability rather than mythology. The mathematics behind Planet 9 suggests that a large planet could still be hiding in the outer solar system. Its mass, distance, and orbital shape would place it in regions too faint for most telescopes to detect. Even the most powerful surveys have blind spots, areas of the sky they have not yet examined with enough depth to reveal a distant, slow-moving world. The search is ongoing, and until the entire sky is mapped to sufficient depth, the possibility remains unresolved. Some scientists remain skeptical. They argue that the clustering of Kuiper Belt objects might result from observational bias. If telescopes are more likely to scan certain regions than others, the objects found in those regions might create an artificial pattern. Others suggest that the gravitational influence could come from a collection of smaller bodies rather than a single large planet. These interpretations remind us that in science, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not proof of existence. Still, the idea that something could exist beyond our current maps continues to motivate research. Astronomers run simulations that test thousands of hypothetical orbits. They examine data from sky surveys conducted over decades. They refine their models with each new discovery of a distant object. Through this patient process, the possibility of a hidden world becomes more or less likely, depending on how well the models align with observed data. This measured process stands in contrast to the certainty found in myth. The ancient stories speak confidently about Nibiru, describing its role in cosmic order with authority. But that authority comes from belief, symbolism, and tradition rather than measurement. When modern interpretations link Nibiru to Planet X, they blend two different ways of knowing. The resulting idea is compelling, but it must be handled carefully. Myth does not contradict science. It simply answers different questions. Myth asks why. Science asks how. When both perspectives are placed together, they create a wider frame through which to view the possibility of Nibiru's existence. If Nibiru is interpreted as a symbolic crossing, then yes, it still exists as part of the way the sky moves and changes. If it is interpreted as a rare celestial visitor, then it exists in the sense that rare objects continue to drift through the solar system. If it is interpreted as a literal world with an elongated orbit, then its existence depends on whether the modern Planet 9 hypothesis is correct. Each interpretation carries its own form of truth. As more discoveries unfold, the outer solar system becomes a place of increasing complexity. New dwarf planets are found each year. Objects with unusual orbits challenge existing models. Comets from distant regions hint at reservoirs of material we can barely detect. These discoveries show that the solar system is far from settled. It contains influences that extend beyond the planets we know, shaping motion in ways that remain partly hidden. In that sense, the idea of Nibiru still being out there reflects a deeper truth. The universe does not reveal everything at once. It offers hints, patterns, and occasional surprises. It leaves a room for possibilities that sit between what is known and what is still being discovered. The ancient stories captured this sense of vastness with symbols and mythic imagery. Modern astronomy captures it with simulations and data. Both remind us that the cosmos contains layers that unfold slowly across time. As astronomers continue to explore the farthest edges of the solar system, the search for Planet 9 will either uncover a new world or reveal that the patterns we see have other explanations. Either outcome will expand our understanding, and as scholars continue to study the ancient records, they will uncover new insights into how early civilizations interpreted the sky, revealing complexities in their observations that continue to surprise modern readers. Between myth and mathematics, the idea of Nibiru remains suspended in a quiet space where human curiosity lives. It is not proven, it is not dismissed, it is simply possible. And in that possibility lies the same sense of wonder that drove ancient sky watchers to carve their observations into clay, trusting that the sky held stories worth remembering. As long as there are regions of the solar system still hidden from view, the question of what might drift through them remains open. The universe is vast, patient, and layered. It holds its secrets lightly, allowing each generation to uncover just a little more. Whether Nibiru is a symbolic crossing or a distant world waiting in the dark, the search for it reminds us that the sky has always been a place where mystery and discovery move side by side, guiding the stories we tell and the questions we continue to explore. In every age, no matter the landscape, no matter the tools or the beliefs, people have found themselves drawn to the sky. They watched it from the tops of ziggurats, from the decks of ships, from fields where seeds waited for the right season, from city rooftops lit by lanterns, and from quiet places where the night remained untouched by noise. The sky has never been merely a backdrop. It has been a companion, a guide, a reminder of rhythms that continue even when everything else falters. It holds a memory deeper than any civilization, moving with a patience that outlasts the rise and fall of nations. And somewhere within that memory sits the idea of the crossing, an ancient belief that something rare once drifted through the heavens, marking a turning point in the story of the world. This belief did not fade when the civilizations of Sumer and Akkad dissolved into sand. It carried forward, woven into myths, symbols, calendars, and rituals across cultures. People continue to sense that the sky was more than a canvas of distant lights. It was a record of moments that shaped the world below, storing those moments in cycles that repeated on scales too vast for a single lifetime to grasp. Even as languages changed and cities rose where deserts once lay, the instinct to look up remained, passing quietly from one generation to the next. In the ancient world, the idea of a crossing was not simply an astronomical event. It was a moment when the familiar sky opened a doorway to something beyond ordinary experience. A bright visitor appeared. A strange alignment held the attention of watchers. A shadow crossed the sun. A star grew in brightness before fading again. These events carried meaning because they interrupted patterns that otherwise felt eternal. Every interruption stood out. Every anomaly seemed significant. And because these events were rare, they lingered in memory long after their physical traces disappeared. The earliest stories tied these moments to the movements of gods. The gods crossed from one realm to another. They descended to teach, or judge, or preserve. They returned to their celestial homes when their work was complete. In these cycles, the movements of stars and deities became woven together. A rare visitor in the sky might signal the arrival of a deity. A departing light might signify a divine retreat. Over time, these associations formed a pattern that gave shape to the idea of Nibiru, a symbol of transition, an embodiment of arrival and disappearance, a reminder that the universe held rhythms far older than humanity. Even when modern minds reshape the idea into something physical, a wandering planet with a long orbit, hidden beyond the familiar planets, the emotional core remained the same. It expressed the sense that the solar system still held surprises, that the universe was not fully mapped, and that somewhere out in the quiet dark something might still drift toward us in a cycle too long to witness more than once. The details changed, but the feeling endured. The memory of the crossing became part of how humanity understood itself. Each era found its own way to describe it. For the Sumerians, it was a sign of divine order. For later civilizations, it became a symbol of destiny, a mark of ages beginning and ending. For modern readers, it became a question of whether ancient memories preserved traces of real astronomical events. For astronomers today, the idea echoes in the careful search for patterns in the orbits of distant objects, where hints of unseen influences suggest that something still waits to be discovered. Through all of this, humanity has continued to look up, often without realizing why. It is instinctive. It is quiet. It is persistent. People stand beneath stars because something in their nature feels connected to the sky. They turn their eyes upward in moments of uncertainty, searching for reassurance in the steady movement of constellations. They look up in moments of celebration, marking time by the phases of the moon or the return of seasonal stars. They look up in curiosity, wondering what lies beyond the reach of their senses. The memory of the crossing is not a single story carved into clay. It is a collection of impressions, ideas, and emotions carried across millennia. It reflects times when the sky changed abruptly enough to leave a mark not only on the world, but on the imagination of those who witnessed it. Those marks were passed down in words, rituals, myths, and later in scientific hypotheses. They survived because they spoke to something fundamental, the belief that the universe moves according to patterns that humans can feel even when they cannot explain them. In modern times, the idea of Nibiru exists in a space shaped by both history and speculation. The ancient word does not refer to a hidden planet in the literal sense used today, but it points toward a concept that still resonates. The idea that rare cosmic events can shape the course of human understanding. When people read old stories and compare them to new astronomical findings, they sense a bridge between ancient memory and modern discovery. The bridge may not be literal, but it is meaningful. It reminds us that the sky has always served as a record of things too large for any one generation to witness fully. The search for Planet 9, driven by equations and data, carries a similar sense of anticipation. Even if the ancient Nibiru was not a physical world, the modern search touches the same part of the human spirit that once stood atop ziggurats waiting for rare signs. This connection does not diminish the scientific effort, it enriches it. The sky has always been a place where imagination and observation meet, where stories take shape in the spaces between stars. The memory of the crossing is also reflected in the way people respond to change. Civilizations have always faced cycles of upheaval and renewal. Floods, droughts, migrations, and technological shifts have reshaped societies countless times. Each time, people looked to the sky for meaning. The sky offered a sense of continuity even when the world below seemed unstable. Its stability made it a natural canvas for interpreting the unfamiliar. When unusual events occurred, they gained weight because they contrasted with the sky's usual calm. This emotional pattern still exists today. People feel a sense of wonder when they see an eclipse, meteor shower, or comet. Even with scientific explanations readily available, the experience carries a quiet weight. It reminds people that the universe is larger than their daily concerns. It touches the same part of the mind that once created stories about gods crossing the heavens. The memory persists because the feeling persists. As technology advances, humanity's relationship with the sky changes, but the instinct remains. Satellites orbit the Earth. Telescopes peer into distant galaxies. Spacecraft travel through regions that ancient astronomers never dreamed existed. Yet even with all these achievements, there are still regions of the solar system waiting to be explored. There are still objects whose orbits hint at unseen forces. There are still mysteries that can only be resolved through patient observation. The memory of the crossing offers a reminder that discovery and interpretation are intertwined. Ancient people interpreted the sky through myth. Modern people interpret it through science. Both approaches seek to understand how the universe shapes life on Earth. And both approaches reveal that the universe is more complex than any one story can capture. Humanity looks up because the sky offers perspective. It reminds people of the long cycles that outlast individual lives. It reveals patterns that stretch across thousands of years. It holds the history of the solar system in its slow movements. Even when no rare visitor appears, the act of looking up connects people to something larger than themselves, something steady and enduring. The memory of Nibiru, whether symbolic or hypothetical, reflects this connection. It represents the idea that the universe contains forces that move on scales beyond ordinary perception. It suggests that the cosmos has rhythms that only the most patient observers can glimpse. It carries the sense that knowledge unfolds slowly through generations, shaped by both myth and mathematics. As the search for distant worlds continues, and as scholars continue to explore the layers of ancient texts, the two perspectives will keep circling the same core truth. The sky has always invited humans to ask what lies beyond. That invitation is part of why humanity still looks up, returning to the same horizon that early civilizations watched with awe. The memory endures not because of certainty, but because of possibility. The possibility that something moved through the sky long ago. The possibility that something still moves there now. The possibility that discovery is never complete. And so, the sky remains what it has always been, a patient witness to the stories, questions and searches that define humanity's long curiosity. It remembers everything that crosses it, and it continues to inspire those who take the time to pause, breathe, and watch the slow drift of the stars as they trace patterns older than history, carrying forward the quiet memory of the crossing into every generation that lifts its eyes to meet them.